8. Joss Merlin was drunk for 5 days. He was insensible most of the time, and lay stretched out on a bed in the kitchen that Mary and her aunt had improvised between them. He slept with his mouth wide open, and the sound of his breathing could be heard from the bedrooms above. About 5 in the evening he would wake for half an hour or so, shouting for brandy and sobbing like a child. His wife went to him at once, and soothed him and settled his pillow. She gave him a weak brandy and water, talking to him gently as she would to a sick child, holding the glass to his lips, and he stared around him with glaring bloodshot eyes, muttering to himself, and shivering like a dog. Aunt Patience became another woman, showing a calm coolness and a presence of mind that Mary had not believed her capable of possessing. She gave herself up entirely to this nursing of her husband. She was obliged to do everything for him, and Mary watched her change his blankets and his linen with a sick feeling of disgust in her own heart, for she could not have borne to go near him. Aunt Patience took it as a matter of course, and the oaths and screams with which he greeted her did not appear to frighten her. These were the only times when she had the controlling of him, and he would let her sponge his forehead with a towel in hot water without protest. Then she would tuck the fresh blanket under him and smooth his matted hair, and in a few minutes he would sleep again, his face purple, his mouth wide open, his tongue protruding, soothing, snoring like a bull. It was impossible to live in the kitchen, and Mary and her aunt turned the little disused parlor into a dwelling room for themselves. For the first time Aunt Patience became something of a companion. She chatted happily of the old days in Helford when she and Mary's mother had been girls together, and she moved swiftly and lightly about the house, and sometimes Mary would hear her humming snatches of old hymns as she passed backwards and forwards to the kitchen. It seemed every 2 months or so Joss Merlin would have these bouts of drinking. The times used to be further apart, but now they were becoming more frequent, and Aunt Patience was never quite certain when they would occur. This present one had been caused by the visit of Squire Bassett to the inn. The landlord had been very angry and upset, she told Mary, and when he came back from the moors at 6 in the evening, he went straight to the bar. She knew then what would happen. Aunt Patience accepted without question her niece's explanatory of losing herself on the moors. She told herself be she told her she must beware of the bogs, and left it that. Mary was greatly relieved. She did not want to give details of the adventure, and she was determined to say nothing of her meeting with the vicar of Alternoon. Meanwhile, Joss Merlin lay in his stupor in the kitchen, and the two women spent 5 comparatively peaceful days. The weather was cold and gray, and did not tempt Mary from the house. But on the 5th morning the wind dropped and the sun shone, and in spite of the adventure that had befallen her only a few days before, Mary decided to brave the moors again. The landlord was awake at 9 and began to shout at the top of his voice, and what was the noise he made, and the smell from the kitchen, that now pervaded the rest of the house, and the sight of Aunt Patience bustling downstairs with clean blankets over her arm, Mary was seized with a rush of disgust and a loathing for the whole business. Feeling very ashamed of herself, she slipped out of the house, rolling a crust of bread in a handkerchief, and crossed the high road to the moors. This time she made for the east of Moor, striking out towards Kilmar, and the whole day in front of her there were no fear of being lost. She kept thinking about Francis Davy, her strange vicar at Alternoon, and she realized how little he had told her of himself, while he had from her a life history in an evening. She thought what an odd figure he must have looked, painting his picture beside the waters of Dawsmere. Atlas, perhaps, his halo of white hair standing up around his neck, and there would be gulls flying inland from the sea, skimming the surface of the lake. He would look like Elijah in the wilderness. She wondered what had called him to priesthood, and whether he was loved by the people of Altrincham. It was nearly Christmas now, and home at Helford people would be decorating with holly and evergreen and mistletoe. There would be a great baking of pastry and cakes, and fattening of turkeys and geese. The little parson, wearing a festive air, would beam upon his world, and on Christmas Eve he would ride up after tea to drink sloe gin at Trillaward. Did Francis Davy decorate his church with holly and call down a blessing upon the people? One thing was certain, there would be little gaiety at Jamaica Inn. Mary had walked an hour or more before she stopped short in her tracks, her further progress barred by the stream that divided and ran opposite directions. The stream lay in a valley between the hills and was encircled by marshes. The country was not unknown to her, and looking on beyond the smooth green face of the tor ahead, she saw a great split hand of Kilmar, pointing his fingers to the sky. She was gazing at Trewartha Marsh once more, where she had wandered that first day, but this time her face was turned to the southeast, and the hills looked different in the brave sunshine. The brook burbled merrily over the stones, and there was a fording gate across the shallow water. The marsh stretched away to the left of her. The soft wind blew the waving strands of grass that shivered in company inside and rustled, and planted amid the pale inviting green were the tufts of coarse brown-tipped grass with yellow stocky strands. These were the treacherous bog islands, suggesting solidity by their breadth, but their weight was of thistledown, and a man's foot planted upon them sank immediately, and the little patches of slate-colored water that rippled here and there would turn into froth and turn black. Mary turned her back on the marsh and forded the gate over the stream. She kept to the high ground with the stream beneath her and followed its course along the winding valley between the hills. There were few clouds today to cast their shadows, and the moors rolled away beyond her, sand-colored under the sun. A solitary curlew stood pensively beside the stream, watching his reflection in the water, and then his long beak darted back with incredible swiftness into the reeds, stabbing at the soft mud, and turning his head, he tucked his legs under him and rose into the air, calling his plaintive note and streaking for the south. Something had disturbed him, and in a few minutes Mary saw what it was. "You okay?" A handful of ponies had clattered down the hill beyond and splashed into the stream to drink. They clod-hopped noisily among the stones, pushing into one another, their tails whisking in the wind. They must have come through a gate on the left a little way ahead that stood wide open, propped by a jagged stone, and led to a rough farm track heavy with mud. Mary leaned against the gate and watched the ponies. Then out of the tail of her eye she saw a man coming down the track carrying a bucket in either hand. She was about to move and continue her walk around the bend of the hill when he waved a bucket in the air and shouted to her. He was Jim Merlin. There was no time to escape, and she stood where she was until he came to her. He wore a grimy shirt that had never seen a washtub, a pair of dirty brown breeches covered with horsehair and filth from an outhouse. He had neither hat nor coat. There was rough stubble on his beard and his jaw. He laughed at her, showing his teeth, looking for all the world as his brother must have done 20 years ago. "So you found your way to me, have you?" he said. "I didn't expect you so soon, or I'd have baked bread in your honor. I haven't washed for 3 days, and I've been living on potatoes. Here, take hold of this bucket." He thrust one of the buckets in her hand before she had time to protest, and was down to the drinking water after the ponies. "Come out of it," he shouted. Get back, will you, fouling my drinking water? Go on, you big black devil. He hit the largest of the ponies on his hindquarters with the end of the bucket, and they stamped up the hill out of the water, kicking their heels in the air. My fault for not shutting the gate, he called to Mary. Bring down the other bucket. The water's clear enough the other side of the brook. She took it with her to the stream, and he filled them both, grinning at her over his shoulder. What would you have done if you hadn't found me at home? He said, wiping his face on his sleeve. Mary could not help smiling. I didn't even know you lived here, she said, and I certainly never walked this way with the intention of finding you. I'd have turned and left if I'd known. I don't believe you, he said. You started out with the hope of sighting me, and it's no use pretending any different. Well, you've come in good time to cook my dinner. There's a piece of mutton in the kitchen. He led the way up the mud track, and rounding the corner they came to a small gray cottage built on the other side of the hill. There were some rough outbuildings at the back and a strip of land for potatoes. A thin stream of smoke rose from the squat chimney. The fire's on, and it won't take you long to boil that scrap of mutton. I suppose you can cook? He said. Mary looked him up and down. Do you always make use of folk this way? She said. I don't often have the chance, he told her, but you may as well stop while you're here. I've done all my own cooking since my mother died, and there's not been a woman in the cottage since. Come in, won't you? She followed him in, bending her head as he did under her blanket. The room was small and square, half the size of the kitchen at Jamaica, with a great open fireplace in the corner. The floor was filthy and littered with rubbish, potato scrapings, cabbage stalks, crumbs of bread. There were odds and ends scattered all over the room, and ashes from the turf fire covered everything. Mary looked about her in dismay. Don't you ever do any of the cleaning? She asked him. You've got this kitchen like a pigsty. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Leave me that bucket of water and find me a broom. I'll not eat my dinner in a place like this. She set to work at once, all her instincts of cleanliness and order aroused by the dirt and the squalor. In half an hour she had the kitchen scrubbed clean as a pin, the stone floor wet and shining, and all the rubbish cleared away. She had found crockery in the cupboard, a strip of tablecloth, with which she proceeded to lay the table, and meanwhile the mutton boiled in the saucepan on the fire, surrounded by potato and turnip. The smell was good, and Jim came in at the door, sniffing the air like a hungry dog. I shall have to keep a woman, he said. I can see that. Will you leave your aunt and come and look after me? You'd have to pay me too much, said Mary. You'd never have money enough for what I'd ask. Women are always mean, he said, sitting down at the table. What they do with their money, I don't know, for they never spend it. My mother was just the same. She used to keep hers hidden in an old stocking, and I never as much as saw the color of it. Make haste with the dinner. I'm empty as a worm. You're impatient, aren't you? Said Mary. No word of thanks to me that's cooked it. Take your hands away, the plate's hot. She put the steaming mutton down in front of him, and he smacked his lips. They taught you something where you came from, anyway, he said. I always say there's two things women ought to do by instinct, and cooking's one of them. Get me a jug of water, will you? You'll find the pitcher outside. But Mary filled a cup for him already, and she passed it to him in silence. We were all born here, said Jim, jerking his head to the ceiling, up in the room overhead. But Joss and Matt were grown men when I was still a little lad, clinging to my mother's skirt. We never saw much of my father, but when he was home, he knew it was all right. We knew it all right. I remember him throwing a knife at Mother once and cut her above the eye, and blood ran down her face. I was scared and ran and hid in that corner by the fire. Mother said nothing. She just bathed her eye in some water and then gave my father his supper. She was a brave woman, I'll say that for her, though she spoke little and never gave us much to eat. She made a bit of pet of me when I was small. On account of being the youngest, I suppose, and my brothers used to beat me when she wasn't looking. Not that they were as thick as you'd think. We were never much of a loving family, and I've seen Joss thrash Matt until he couldn't stand. Matt was a funny devil. He was quiet, more like my mother. He was drowned down in the marsh yonder. You could shout there until your lungs burst. No one would hear you except a bird or two and a stray pony. I've nearly caught there myself in my time. How long has your mother been dead? Said Mary. 7 years this Christmas, he answered, helping himself to more boiled mutton. What with my father hanged and Matt drowned and Joss gone off to America, and me growing up as wild as a hog, she turned religious and used to pray here by the hour, calling on the Lord. I couldn't abide that, and I cleared off out of it. I shipped on a Padstow schooner for a time. The sea didn't suit my stomach, so I came back home. I found Mother gone as thin as a skeleton. You ought to eat more, I told her, but she wouldn't listen to me, so I went off again and stayed in Plymouth for a while, picking up a shilling or two in my own way. I came back here to have my Christmas dinner, and I found the place deserted and the door locked up. I was mad. I hadn't eaten for 24 hours. I went back to North Hill, and they told me my mother had died. She had been buried 3 weeks. I might just as well have stayed in Plymouth for all the dinner I got that Christmas. There's a piece of cheese in the cupboard behind you. Will you eat half of it? There's maggots in it, but they won't hurt you. Mary shook her head, and she let him get up and reach for it himself. What's the matter? He said. You look like a sick cow. Has the mutton turned sour on you already? Mary watched him return to his seat and spread the hunk of dry cheese onto a scrap of stale bread. It'll be a good thing when there's not a Merlin left in Cornwall, she said. It's better to have disease on a country than a family like yours. You and your brother were born twisted and evil. Do you never think of what your mother must have suffered? Jim looked at her in surprise, and the bread and cheese halfway to his mouth. Mother was all right, he said. She never complained. She was used to us. Why, she married my father at 16. She never had time to suffer. Joss was born the year after, and then Matt. Her time was taken up in rearing them, and by the time they were out of her hands, she had to start all over again with me. I was an afterthought, I was. Father got drunk at Launceston Fair after selling 3 cows that didn't belong to him. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now. Pass that jug. Mary had finished. She got up and began to clear away the plates in silence. How's the landlord of Jamaica Inn? Said Jim, tilting back on his chair and watching her dip the plates in water. Drunk like his father before him, said Mary shortly. That'll be the ruin of Joss, said his brother seriously. He soaks himself insensible and lies like a log for days. One day he'll kill himself with it. The darn fool. How long has it lasted this time? 5 days. Oh, that's nothing to Joss. He'd lie there for a week if you let him. Then he'll come to staggering on his feet like a newborn calf with a mouth as black as Trewarthen Marsh. Then he'd rid himself of the surplus liquid, and the rest of the drink is soaked into him. That's when you want to watch him. He's dangerous then. You look out for yourself. He'll not touch me. I'll take good care of that, said Mary. He's got other things to worry him. There's plenty to keep him busy. Don't be mysterious, nodding to yourself with that mouth pursed up. Has anything been happening at Jamaica? It depends on how you look at it, said Mary, watching him over the plate she was wiping. We had Mr. Bassett from North Hill last week. Jim brought his chair to the ground with a crash. The devil you did, he said. And what had the squire to say to you? Uncle Joss was from home, said Mary. And Mr. Bassett insisted on coming into the inn and going through the rooms. He broke down the door at the end of the passage, he and his servant between them, and the room was empty. He seemed disappointed and very surprised, and he rode away in a fit of temper. He asked after you, as it happened, and I told him I'd never set eyes on you. Jim whistled tunelessly, his expression blank as Mary told her tale. But when she came to the end of her sentence, and the mention of his name, his eyes narrowed, and then he laughed. Why did you lie to him? He asked. It seemed less trouble at the time, said Mary. If I'd thought longer, no doubt I'd have told him the truth. You've got nothing to hide, have you? Nothing much except that black pony you saw by the brook belongs to him, said Jim carelessly. He was dapple gray last week and worth a small fortune to the squire, who bred him himself. I'll make a few pounds with him at Launceston if I'm lucky. Come down and have a look at him. They went out into the sun, Mary wiping her hands on her apron, and she stood for a few moments at the door of the cottage while Jim went off to the horses. The cottage was built on the slope of the hill above the wily brook, whose course wound away in the valley and was lost in further hills. Behind the house stretched a wide and level plain rising to great tors on either hand, and this grassland, like a grazing place for cattle, with no boundary as far as the eye could reach except the craggy menace of Kilmar, must be the strip of town known as 12 More. Mary pictured Joss Merlin running out of the doorway here as a child, his mat of hair falling over his eyes in a fringe, and the gaunt, lonely figure of his mother standing behind him, her arms folded, watching him with a question in her eyes. A world of sorrow and silence. Anger and bitterness, too, must have passed beneath the roof of this small cottage. There was a shout and a clatter of hoofs, and Jim rode up round the corner of the house astride the black pony. "This is the fellow I wanted you to have," he said. "But you're so close with your money. He'll carry you well, too. The squire bred him for his wife. And you're sure you won't change your mind?" Mary shook her head, and she laughed. "You'd have me tie him up in the stable at Jamaica, I suppose," she said, "and when Mr. Bassett calls again he wouldn't be likely to recognize him, would he? Thanking you for your trouble, but I'd rather not risk it all the same. I've lied enough to your family, Jim Merlin, for one lifetime." Jim pulled a long face and slid to the ground. "You refused the best bargain you'll ever have offered to you," he said, "and I won't give you the chance again. He'll go to Launceston on Christmas Eve. The dealers there will swallow him up." He clapped his hands on his hindquarters of the pony. "Get on with you, then." The animal made a startled dash for the gap in the bank. Jim broke off a piece of grass and began to chew it, glancing sideways at his companion. "What did Squire Bassett expect you to see at Jamaica Inn?" he said. Mary looked at him straight in the eyes. "You ought to know that better than I do," she answered. Jim chewed his grass thoughtfully, spitting out little bits of it onto the ground. "How much do you know?" he said, suddenly, throwing the stalk away. Mary shrugged her shoulders. "I didn't come here to answer questions," he said. "I had enough of that with Mr. Bassett." "It was lucky for Joss the stuff had been shifted," said his brother quietly. "I told him last week he was sailing too close to the wind. It's only a matter of time before they catch him, and all he does in self-defense is to get drunk. The darn fool." Mary said nothing. If Jim was trying to tap her by this exhibition of frankness, he would be disappointed. "You must have a good view from that little room over the porch," he said. "Do they wake you out of your beauty sleep?" "How do you know that's my room?" Mary asked swiftly. He looked taken aback at the question. She saw the surprise flash through his eyes. Then he laughed and picked another piece of grass from the plate. "The window was wide open when I rode into the yard the other morning," he said, "and there is a little bit of blind blowing in the wind. I've never seen a window open at Jamaica Inn before." The excuse was plausible, but hardly good enough for Mary. A horrible suspicion came into her mind. Could it have been Jim who was hidden in the empty guest room that Saturday night? Something went cold inside her. "Why are you so silent about it all?" he continued. "Do you think I'm going to my brother and say, 'Here, that niece of yours, she lets her tongue run away with her'? Darn it, Mary, you're not blind or deaf. Even a child would smell a rat if he lived a month at Jamaica Inn." "What are you trying to make me tell you?" said Mary. "And what does it matter to you how much I know? All I think about is getting my aunt away from the place as soon as possible. I told you that when you came to the inn. It may take a little time to persuade her, and I'll have to be patient. As for your brother, he can drink himself to death for all I care. His life is his own, and so is his business. It has nothing to do with me." Jim whistled and kicked at a loose stone with his foot. "So smuggling doesn't appall you after all," he said. "You'd let my brother line every room at Jamaica with kegs of brandy and rum, you'd say nothing is at it? But supposing he meddled in other things, supposing it was a question of life and death, and perhaps murder, what then?" He turned around and faced her, and she could see that this time he was not playing with her. His careless, laughing manner was gone, and his eyes were grave, but she could not read what lay behind them. "I don't know what you mean," said Mary. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. It was as though he debated some problem in his mind and could only find solution in the expression of her face. All his resemblance to his brother vanished. He was harder, older suddenly, and of a different breed. "Perhaps not," he said at length, "but you'll come to know if you stay long enough. Why does your aunt look like a living ghost? Can you tell me that? Ask her next time the wind blows from the northwest." began to whistle again softly, his hands in his pockets. Mary stared back at him in silence. He spoke in riddles, but whether it was to frighten her or not, she could not say. Jim the horse stealer, with his careless, impecunious manner. She could understand allow for, but this was a new departure. She was not sure whether she liked it as well. He laughed shortly and shrugged his shoulders. There will be trouble between Joss and myself one day, and it's he that'll be sorry for it, not I, he said. And with that cryptic remark, he turned on his heel and went off onto the moor after the pony. Mary watched him thoughtfully, her arms tucked into her shawl. So her first instinct had been right, and there was something behind the smuggling after all. The stranger in the bar that night had talked of murder, and now Jim himself had echoed his words. She was not a fool then, nor was she hysterical, whatever she was considered by the vicar of Alternon. What part Jim Merlin played in all this was hard to say, but that was concerned in it somewhere. She did not doubt him for a moment. And if he was the man who crept so stealthily downstairs behind her uncle, why, he must know well enough that she had left her room that night and was in hiding somewhere and had listened to them. Then he, above all men, must remember the rope on the beam and guess that she had seen it after he and the landlord had gone out into the moor. If Jim was the man, there would be reason enough for all his questions. How much do you know? He had asked her, but she had not told him. The conversation had cast a shadow on her day. She wanted to be off now and rid of him and alone with her thoughts. She began to walk slowly down the hill towards the Withy brook. She had reached the gate with the bottom of the track when she heard his running footsteps behind her, and he flung himself first at the gate, looking like a half-bred gypsy, with his growth of beard and his filthy breeches. "Why are you going?" he said. "It's early yet. It'll be dark till after 4. I'll walk with you back, and then as far as Rushford Gate." "What's the matter with you?" He took her chin in his hands and looked into her face. "I believe you're frightened of me," he said. "You think I've got barrels of brandy and rolls of tobacco in the little old bedrooms above, and that I'm going to show them to you and then cut your throat. That's it, isn't it? We're a desperate lot of fellows, we Merlins, and Jim is the worst of the pack. Is that what you're thinking?" She smiled back at him in spite of herself. "Something of the sort," she confessed. "But I'm not afraid of you. You needn't think that. I'd even like you if you didn't remind me so much of your brother. I can't help my face," he said, "and I'm much better looking than Joss. You must allow me that." "Oh, you've conceit enough to make up for all the other qualities you lack," agreed Mary, "and I'll not deprive you of your handsome face. You may break as many hearts as you please. Now let me go. It's a long walk back to Jamaica, and I don't fancy losing myself on the moors again." "And why did you lose yourself before?" he asked. Mary frowned slightly. The words had escaped her. "The other afternoon I was out on the west moor," she said, "and the fog came on early. I wandered some time before I found my way back." "You're a fool to go walking," he said. "There's places between Jamaica and Rufter that would swallow a herd of cattle, to say nothing of a slip-up thing like you. It's no pastime for a woman, anyhow. What did you do it for?" "I wanted to stretch my legs. I've been shut in the house for days." "Well, Mary Ellen, next time you want to stretch your legs, you can stretch them in this direction. If you come through the gate, you can't go wrong. Not if you leave the marsh on your left-hand side, as you did today. Are you coming to Launceston with me on Christmas Eve?" "What will you be doing over to Launceston, Jim Merlin?" "Only selling Mr. Bassat's black pony for him, my dear. You'd be best away from Jamaica Inn that day, if I know anything about my brother. He'll be just recovering from his brandy bed by then, and looking for trouble. If they're used to you gallivanting over the moors, they'll not say anything about your absence. I'll bring you home by midnight. Say you're coming, Mary." "Supposing you are caught in Launceston with Mr. Bassat's pony?" "You would look a fool then, wouldn't you? And so would I. They'd clap me into prison alongside of you." "No one's going to catch me, not yet awhile anyway. Take a risk, Mary. Don't you like excitement? That you're so careful of your own skin? They must breed you soft down Helford way." She rose like a fish to his bait. "All right then, Jim Merlin. You needn't think I'm afraid. I'd just as soon be in prison as live in Jamaica Inn anyway. How do we go to Launceston?" "I'll take you there in the jingle with Mr. Bassat's black pony behind us. Do you know your way to North Hill across the moor?" "No, I do not." "You only have to follow your nose. Go a mile along the high road, and you'll come to a gap in the hedge of the top hill, bearing to the right. You'll have Carrie Tor ahead of you, and Hawk's Tor away on your right. If you keep straight on, you can't miss your way. I'll come half the distance to meet you. We'll keep to the moor as much as we can. There will be some traveling on the road Christmas Eve. What time shall I start then? We'll let the other folk make the pace and then get there in the forenoon, and the streets will be thick enough for us by 2 o'clock. You can leave Jamaica at 11 if you like. I'll make no promises. If you don't see me, you can go on your way. You forget Aunt Patience may need me. That's right, make your excuses. There's the gate over the stream, said Mary. You don't have to come any further. I can find my own way. I go straight over the brow of that hill, don't I? You can give the landlord my respects if you like, and tell them I hope his temper has improved, and his tongue also. Ask him if he'd care for me to hang a bunch of mistletoe on the porch of Jamaica Inn. Mind the water. Do you want me to carry you through the gate? You'll wet your feet. If I went up to my waist, it wouldn't hurt me. Good afternoon, Jim Merlin. And Mary leaped boldly across the running brook with one hand on the gate to guide her. Her petticoat dipped in the water, and she lifted it up out of the way. She heard Jim laugh from his bank on the other side, and she walked away up the hill without a backward glance or a wave of her head. Let him match himself against the men of the South, she thought, against the fellows of Helford and Gleek and Monacan. There was a blacksmith at Constantine who could twist him round his little finger. Jim Merlin had to be little proud about. A horse thief, a common smuggler, a rogue and a murderer into the bargain, perhaps. They bred fine men on the moors, it seemed. Mary was not afraid of him, and to prove it, she would ride beside him in his jingle to Launceston on Christmas Eve. Darkness was falling as she crossed the high road and into the yard. As usual, the inn looked dark and uninhabited, and the door bolted and the windows barred. She went round to the back of the house and tapped on the door of the kitchen. It was opened immediately by her aunt, who seemed pale and anxious. Your uncle has been asking for you all day, she said. Where have you been? It's nearly 5 o'clock. You've been gone since morning. I was walking on the moors, replied Mary. I didn't think it mattered. Why should Uncle Joss ask for me? She was aware of a little pang of nervousness, and she looked toward his bed in the corner of the kitchen. It was empty. Where is he gone? She said. Is he better? He wanted to sit in the parlor, said her aunt. He said he was tired of the kitchen. He's been sitting there all the afternoon at the window, looking out for you. You must humor him now, Mary, and speak fair to him, and not go against him. This is the bad time, when he's recovering. He will get a little stronger every day, and he'll be very self-willed, violent, perhaps. You'll be careful what you say to him, won't you, Mary? This was the old Aunt Patience, with nervous hands and twitching mouth, who glanced over her shoulder as she talked. It was pitiable to see her, and Mary caught something of her agitation. Why should he want to see me? She said. He never has anything to say to me. What can he want? Aunt Patience blinked and worked her mouth. It's only his fancy, she said. He mutters and talks to himself. You must pay attention to what he says at times like these. He's not really himself. I'll go and tell him you're home. She went out to the room and along the passage to the parlor. Mary crossed to the dresser and poured herself out a glass of water from the pitcher. Her throat was very dry. The glass trembled in her hands, and she cursed herself for a fool. She had been bold enough on the moors just now, and no sooner was she inside the inn than her courage must leave her, quaking and nervous as a child. Aunt Patience came back into the room. He's quiet for the moment, she whispered. He's dozed off in the chair. He may sleep now for the evening. We'll have our supper early and get it finished. There's some cold pie for you here. All hunger had gone from Mary, and she had to force her food. She drank 2 cups of scalding tea, and then pushed her plate away. Neither of the women spoke. Aunt Patience kept looking towards the door. When they had finished supper, they cleared things away silently. Mary threw some turf on the fire and crouched beside it. The bitter blue smoke rose in the air, stinging her eyes, but no warmth came to her from the smoldering turf. Outside in the hall, the clock struck 6 o'clock with a sudden whirring note. Mary held her breath as she counted the strokes. They broke upon the silence with deliberation. It seemed an eternity before the last note fell and echoed through the house and died away. The slow ticking of the clock continued. There was no sound from the parlor, and Mary breathed again. Aunt Patience sat at the table, threading a needle and cotton by candlelight. Her lips were pursed and her forehead puckered to a frown as she bent to her task. The long evening passed, and still there was no call from the landlord in the parlor. Mary nodded her head, her eyes closed in spite of herself. And in that stupid, heavy state between sleeping and waking, she heard her aunt move quietly from her chair and put her work away in the cupboard beside the dresser. In a dream she heard her whisper in her ear, "I'm going to bed. Your uncle won't wake now. He must have settled for the night. I shan't disturb him." Mary murmured something in reply, and half-consciously she heard the light patter of the footsteps in the passage outside and the creaking of the stairs. On the landing above, a door closed softly. Mary felt the lethargy of sleep steal upon her, and her head sank lower into her hands. The slow ticking of the clock made a pattern in her mind, like footsteps dragging on a high road. 1, 2, 1, 2. They followed one another. She was on the moors beside the running brook, and the burden that she carried was heavy, too heavy to bear. If she could lay it aside for a little while, and rest herself beside the bank and sleep. It was cold, though, much too cold. Her foot was wringing wet from the water. She must pull herself higher up the bank, out of the way. The fire was out. There was no more fire. Mary opened her eyes and saw that she was lying on the floor beside the white ashes of the fire. The kitchen was very cold and the light was dim. The candle had burned low. She yawned and shivered and stretched her stiff arms. When she lifted her eyes, she saw the doors of the kitchen open very slowly, little by little, an inch at a time. Mary sat without moving, her hands on the cold floor. She waited and nothing happened. The door moved again and then was flung wide, crashing against the wall behind it. Joss Merlin stood on the threshold of the room, his arms outstretched, rocking on his 2 feet. At first she thought she had not noticed her. His eyes were fixed on the wall in front of him, and he stood still where he was without venturing further into the room. She crouched low and her head beneath the level of the table, hearing nothing but the steady thump of her heart. Oh, I don't know where I was. At first she thought he had not noticed her. His eyes were fixed on the wall in front of him, and he stood still where he was, without venturing further into the room. She crouched low, her head beneath the level of the table, hearing nothing but the steady thump of her heart. Slowly he turned in her direction and stared at her a moment or two without speaking. When his voice came, he was strained and hoarse, hardly above a whisper. "Who's there?" he said. "What are you doing? Why don't you speak?" His face was a gray mask, drained of its usual color. His bloodshot eyes fastened themselves upon her without recognition. Mary did not move. "Put away that knife," he whispered. "Put it away, I tell you." She stretched her hand along the floor and touched the leg of a chair with the tips of her fingers. She could not hold on to it unless she moved. It was out of reach. She waited, holding her breath. He stepped forward into the room, his head bent, his two hands feeling the air, and he crept slowly along the floor towards her. Mary watched his hands until they were within a yard of her, and she could feel his breath on her cheek. "Uncle Joss," she said softly. "Uncle Joss." He crouched where he was, staring down at her, then he leaned forward and touched her hair and her lips. "Mary," he said. "Is it you, Mary? Why don't you speak to me? Where have they gone? Have you seen them?" "You made a mistake, Uncle Joss," she said. "There is no one here, only myself. Aunt Patience is upstairs. Are you ill? Can I help you?" He looked about him in the half-light, searching the corners of the room. "They can't scare me," he whispered. "Dead men don't harm the living. They're blotted out like a candle. That's it, isn't it, Mary?" She nodded, watching his eyes. He pulled himself to a chair and sat down, his hands outstretched on the table. He sighed heavily and passed his tongue over his lips. "It's dreams," he said, "all dreams. The faces stand out like live things in the darkness, and I wake with the sweat pouring down my back. I'm thirsty, Mary. Here's the key. Go into the bar and fetch me some brandy." He fumbled in his pocket and produced a bunch of keys. She took them from him, her hand trembling, and slipped out of the room into the passage. She hesitated for a moment outside, wondering whether she should creep upstairs at once to her room and lock the door, and leave him to rave alone in the kitchen. She began to tiptoe along the passage to the hall. Suddenly he shouted to her from the kitchen, "Where are you going?" "I told you to fetch the brandy from the bar." She heard the chair scrape as he pushed away from the table. She was too late. She opened the door of the bar and felt in the cupboard among the bottles. When she returned to the kitchen, he was sprawling at the table, his head in his hands. At first she thought he was asleep again, but at the sound of her footsteps he lifted his head and stretched his arms and leaned back in the chair. She put the bottle and a glass on the table in front of him. He filled the glass half full and held it between his two hands, watching her all the while over the rim of it. "You're a good girl," he said. "I'm fond of you, Mary. You've got sense, and you've got pluck. You'd make a good companion to a man. They ought to have made you a boy." He rolled the brandy around on his tongue, smiling foolishly, and then he winked at her and pointed his finger. They pay gold for this up country," he said. "The best money can buy. King George himself hasn't had better brandy than this in his cellar." "And what do I pay?" "Not one bloody sixpence. We drink free at Jamaica Inn." He laughed and put out his tongue. "It's a hard game, Mary, but it's a man's game for all that. I've risked my neck 10, 20 times. I've had the fellows thundering at my heels with a pistol shot whistling through my hair. They can't catch me, Mary. I'm too cunning. I've been at the game too long. Before we came here, I was at Padstow working for the shore. We ran the lugger once a fortnight with the spring tides. There are 5 of us in it, besides myself. But there's no money working in a small way. You've got to do it big, and you've got to take your orders. There's over 100 of us now working inland to the border from the coast. I've seen blood in my time, Mary. I've seen men killed a score of times, but this game beats it all. It's running side by side with death." He beckoned her to his side, winking again, glancing first over his shoulder to the door. "Here," he whispered, "come close, down here by my side where I can talk to you. You've got guts in you, I can see that. You're not scared like your aunt. We ought to be partners, you and I." He seized hold of Mary's arm and pulled her on the floor beside his chair. "It's this cursed drink that makes a fool of me," he said. "I'm as weak as a rat when it has a hold of me. You can see that, and I have dreams, nightmares. I see things that never scare me when I'm sober. Darn it, Mary, I've killed men with my own hands, trampled them under water, beaten them with rocks and stones, and I've never thought no more about it. I've slept in my bed like a child, but when I'm drunk I see them in my dreams. I see their white-green faces staring at me, with their eyes eaten by fish, and some of them are torn with the flesh hanging on their bones and ribbons, and some of them have seaweed in their hair. There was a woman once, Mary. She was clinging to a raft, and she had a child in her arms. Her hair was streaming down her back. The ship was close in on the rocks, you see, and the sea was as flat as your hand, and they were all coming in alive, the whole bunch of them. Why, the water in places didn't come above your waist. She cried out to me to help her, Mary, and I smashed her face with a stone. She fell back, her hands beating the raft. She let go the child, and I hit her again. I watched them drown in 4 feet of water. We were scared then. We were afraid some of them would reach the shore. For the first time we hadn't reckoned on the tide. In half an hour they'd be walking dry-shod on the sand. We had to pelt them all with stones, Mary. We had to break their arms and legs. And they drowned there in front of us like a woman and her child. And the water not up to their shoulders. They drowned because we smashed them with rocks and stones. They drowned because we couldn't stand. Because they couldn't stand. His face was close to Mary, his red flecked eyes staring into hers, and his breath on her cheek. "Did you never hear of Rutgers before?" he whispered. Outside in the passage the clock struck 1 o'clock, and a single note rang in the air like summons. Neither of them moved. The room was very cold, for the fire had sunk away to nothing, and a little current of air blew in from the open door. The yellow flame of the candle bowed and flickered. Bowed? He reached out to her and took her hand. It lay limp in his, like a dead hand. Perhaps he saw something of the frozen horror in her face, for he left her go and turned away his eyes. He stared straight before him at the empty glass, and he began to drum with his fingers on the table. Crouched on the ground beside him, Mary watched a fly crawl across his hand. She watched it pass through the short black hairs and over the thick veins of the knuckles, and it ran to the tips of the long, slim fingers. She remembered the swift and sudden grace of those fingers when they cut bread for her the first evening, and how if they chose they could be delicate and light. She watched them drumming down on the table, and in her fancy she saw them curl around a block of jagged stone and fasten upon it. She saw the stone flying through the air. Once more he turned to her, his whisper hoarse, and he jerked his head towards the ticking of the clock. "Are you okay?" "Can you breathe?" "Oh." Once more he turned to her, his whisper hoarse, and he jerked his head towards the ticking of the clock. "The sound of it rings in my head sometimes," he said, "and when it struck 1 just now it was like the tolling of a bell-buoy in a bay. I've heard it come travelling down the air on a westerly wind. 1, 2, 1, 2, backwards and forwards the clapper goes against the bell, as though it tolled for the dead men. I've heard it in my dreams. I heard it tonight, a mournful, weary sound, Mary, is a bell-buoy out on the bay. It rubs on your nerves and you want to scream. When you work on the coast you have to pull out to them in a boat and muffle them, wrap the tongue in flannel. That deadens them. There's silence then. Maybe it's a misty night with the patches of white fog on the water, and outside the bay there will be a ship casting for scent like a hound. She listens for the boy, and no sound comes to her. And she comes in then, driving through the fog. She comes straight in to us, who are waiting for her, Mary, and we see her shudder suddenly and strike, and then the surf has her. We reached for the He reached for the bottle of brandy, and let a little liquid trickle slowly into the glass. He smelt it and rolled it on his tongue. "Have you ever seen flies caught in a jar of treacle?" he said. "I've seen men like that, stuck in the rigging like this swarm of flies. They cling there for safety, shouting in terror at the sight of this earth. Just like flies they are, spread out in the yards. Little black dots of men. I've seen the ship break up beneath them, and their masts and yards snap like thread, and there they'll be, flung into the sea to swim for their lives. But when they reached the shore, they are dead men, Mary. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and stared at her. Dead men tell no tales, Mary, he said. His face nodded at her and narrowed suddenly, and was blotted out. No longer was she kneeling on the kitchen floor, her hands gripping the table. She was a child again, running beside her father on the cliffs beyond St. Cavern. He swung her up onto his shoulder, and there were other men running with them, who shouted and cried. Somebody pointed to the distant sea, and clinging to her father's head, she saw a great white ship like a bird rolling helplessly in through the through of the sea, her masts broken short and her sails sailing in the water beside her. "What are they doing?" asked the child that had been herself, and nobody answered her. They stood where they were, staring in horror at the ship that rolled and plunged. "God have mercy upon them," said her father, and the child Mary began to cry, calling for her mother, who came at once from among the crowd and took her in her arms, and walked away with her out of sight of the sea. There all memory snapped and vanished, and there was no ending to the story. But when she grew to understanding, and was no longer a child, her mother would talk of the day that had gone to St. Crevern, when a great bark had sunken with all on board, her back broken on the dreaded manacles. Mary shivered and sighed, and once more her uncle's face loomed before her in its frame of matted hair, and she was kneeling beside him again in the kitchen at Jamaica Inn. She felt deadly sick, and her hands and feet were icy cold. She longed to stumble to her bed and bury her head in her hands, pulling her blanket and pillow over her for greater darkness. Perhaps if she pressed her hands against her eyes she could blot out his face and the pictures he had painted for her. Perhaps if she thrust her fingers in her ears she would muffle the sound of his voice and the thunder of the surf upon the shore. Here she could see the pale faces of drowned men, their arms above their heads. She could hear the scream of terror and the cries. She could hear the mournful clamor of the bellboy as it swayed backwards and forwards in the sea. Mary shivered again. She looked up at her uncle, and she saw that he had sloped forward in his chair, and his head had fallen on his chest. His mouth was wide open, and he snorted and sputtered as he slept. His long dark eyelashes swept his cheeks like a fringe. His arms rested on the table before him, and his hands were clasped as though in prayer. "Are you okay?" "I'm concerned. It seems like you're..." "My cat's nose. He has issues with his nose." "Can you sneeze?" Hmm. I got that booger. Can I get the other one? Look at the other booger. Can I get the other booger? Can I get the other booger? Oh no, you won't leave. Oh, you sneezed. You sneezed, baby. Very good boy. We'll come back later, okay? You could just stay. You know that. Okay. I'm back. Um, I can move the laptop now to the window. Well, not window exactly, but to here. Here we go. It's okay. I wash my hair really quick. Um, 9. On Christmas Eve, the sky was overcast and threatened rain. It had turned mild, too, in the night, and the mud in the yard was churned where the cows had trodden. The walls of Mary's bedroom felt damp to her hand, for there was a great yellow patch in one corner caused by the shrinking plaster. Mary leaned out of the window, and the soft, wet wind blew upon her face. In an hour's time Jim Merlin would be waiting for her on the moor, to take her to Launceston Fair. Whether she met him or not depended upon herself, and she could not make up her mind. She had grown older in 4 days, and the face that looked back at her from the spotted, cracked mirror was drawn and tired. There were dark rings beneath her eyes, and little hollows in her cheeks. Sleep came late to her at night, and she had no appetite for food. For the first time in her life, she saw a resemblance between herself and her Aunt Patience. They had the same pucker of the forehead and the same mouth. If she pursed her lips and worked them, biting the edges, it might be Aunt Patience who stood there, with the lank brown hair framing her face. The trick was an easy one to catch, as was the nervous twisting of the hands, and Mary turned away from the tell-tale mirror and began to pace up and down her cramped room. During the past few days she had kept as much as possible to the privacy of her own room, excusing herself on the score of a chill. Mary could not trust herself to speak to her aunt at present, not for any length of time. Her eyes would have betrayed her. They would look at one another with the same dumb horror, the same hidden anguish, and Aunt Patience would have understood. They shared a secret now, a secret that must never be spoken between them. Mary wondered how many years Aunt Patience had kept that knowledge to herself in an agony of silence. No one would ever know how greatly she had suffered. Wherever she should go in the future, the pain of that knowledge would go with her. It could never leave her alone. At last Mary was able to understand the pale, twitching face, the hands that plucked at the dress, the wide, staring eyes. The evidence screamed at her now that she knew. At first she had felt sick, deadly sick. She had lain on her bed at night, praying for the mercy of sleep, and it had been denied her. There were faces in the darkness that she had not known, the worn and weary faces of drowned people. There was a child with broken wrists, and a woman whose long wet hair clung to her face, and the screaming, frightened faces of men who had never learned to swim. Sometimes it seemed to her that her own mother and father were among them. They looked up at her with wide eyes and pallid lips, and they stretched out their hands. Perhaps this was what Aunt Patience suffered, alone in her room at night. The faces came to her too and pleaded, and she pushed them away. She would not give them release. In her own way, Aunt Patience was a murderer too. She had killed them by her silence. Her guilt was as great as Jos Merlin's himself, for she was a woman and he was a monster. He was bound to her flesh, and she let him remain. Now that it was the third day, the first horror had passed. Mary felt indifferent, rather old and very tired. Most of the feeling had gone from her. It seemed to her that she had always known now, that at the back of her mind she had been prepared. The first sight of Jos Merlin, standing beneath the porch with a lantern in his hands, had been a warning, while the sound of the coach rattling away down a high road and out of her hearing had rung like a farewell. In the old days at Helford there had been whispers of these things, little snatches of gossip overheard in village lanes, a fragment of story, a denial, a shake of the head, but men did not talk much, and the stories were discouraged. 50 years ago, perhaps, when her father had been young, but not now, not in the light of a new century. Once more she saw her uncle's face pressed close to hers, and she heard his whisper in her ear, "Did you never hear of wreckers before?" These were words that she had never heard breathed, but Aunt Patience had lived among them for 10 years. Mary did not consider her uncle any more. She had lost her fear of him. There was only loathing left in her heart, loathing and disgust. He had lost all hold on humanity. He was a beast that walked by night. Now that she had seen him drunk, she knew him for what he was. He could not frighten her. Neither he nor the rest of his company. They were things of evil, rotting the countryside, and she would never rest until they were trodden underfoot, cleared, and blotted out. Sometimes would not save them again. There remained Aunt Patience and Jim Merlin. He broke into her thoughts against her will, and she did not want him. There was enough on her mind without reckoning with Jim. He was too like his brother, his eyes and his mouth and his smile. There was the danger of it. She could see her uncle in his walk, in the turn of his head, and she knew why Aunt Patience had made a fool of herself 10 years ago. It would be easy enough to fall in love with Jim Merlin. Men had not counted for much in her life up to present. There had been too much to do on the farm at Helford to worry about them. There had been lads who smiled at her in church and gone with her to picnics harvest time. Once a neighbor had kissed her behind a hayrick after a glass of cider. It was all very foolish, and she had avoided the man ever since, a harmless enough fellow too, who forgot the incident 5 minutes later. Anyway, she would never marry. It was a long while since she had decided that. She would save money in some way and do a man's work on a farm. Once she got away from Jamaica Inn and could put it behind her and make some sort of home for Aunt Patience, she was not likely to have time on her hands to think of men. And there, in spite of herself, came Jim's face again, with the growth of a beard like a tramp and his dirty shirt and his old, bold, offensive stare. He lacked tenderness, he was rude, and he had more than a streak of cruelty in him. He was a thief and a liar. He stood for everything she feared and hated and despised, but she knew she could love him. Nature cared nothing for prejudice. Men and women were like the animals on the farm at Helford, she supposed, and there was a common law of attraction for all living things, some similarity of skin or touch, and they would go to one another. There was no choice made with the mind. Animals did not reason, neither did birds in the air. Mary was no hypocrite. She was bred to the soil, and she had lived too long with the birds and beasts, and had watched them mate, and bear their young, and die. There was precious little romance in nature, and she would not look for it in her own life. She had seen the girls at home walk with their village lads, and there would be holding of hands and blushing and confusion, and long drawn sighs, and gazing at the moonlight on the water. Mary would see them wander down the grass lane at the back of the farm. Lover's lane, they called it, though the older men had a better word for it than that, and the lad would have his arm around the waist of his girl, and she with her head on his shoulder. And they would look at the stars and the moon, and the flaming sunset if it was summer weather, and Mary, coming out of the cowshed, wiped the sweat from her face with dripping hands, and thought of the newborn calf she had left beside its mother. She looked after the departing couple and smiled, shrugged her shoulders, and going into the kitchen, she told her mother there would be a wedding in Helford before the month was past, and then the bells would ring and the cake be cut, and the lad in his Sunday clothes would stand on the steps of the church and with a shining face and shuffling his feet with his bride beside him, dressed in muslin, her hair straight her straight hair curled for the occasion, but before the year was out the moon and the stars could shine all night for all they cared. When the lad came home at evening, tired from his work in the fields, and calling sharply that his supper was burned, not fit for a dog, while the girl snapped at him from the bedroom overhead, her figure sagging and her curls gone, pacing backward and forward with a bundle in her arms and mewed like a cat and would not sleep. There was no talk then of the moonlight on the water. No, Mary had no illusions about romance. Falling in love was a pretty name for it, that was all. Jim Merlin was a man, and she was a woman, and whether it was his hands or his skin or his smile she did not know, but something inside her responded to him, and the very thought of him was an irritant and a stimulant at the same time. It nagged at her and would not let her be. She knew she would have to see him again. Once more she looked up at the grey sky and the low-flying clouds. If she were going to Launceston, then it was time to make ready and be away. There would be no excuses to make. She had grown hard in the last 4 days. Aunt Patience could think what she liked. If she had any intuition, she must guess that Mary did not want to see her, and she would look at her husband with his bloodshot eyes and his shaking hands, and she would understand. Once more, perhaps for the last time, the drink had loosened his tongue. His secret was spilt, and Mary held his future in her hands. She had not yet determined what use to make of her knowledge, but she would not save him again. Today she would go to Launceston with Jim Merlin, and this time it was he who would answer her questions. He would show some humility too when he realized she was no longer afraid of him, but could destroy them when she chose. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow could take care of itself. There was always Francis Davy and his promise. There would be peace and shelter for her at the house in Alternan. This was a strange Christmastide, she pondered, as she strode across the east moor with Hawk's Tor as her guide, and the hills rolling away from her on either side. Last year she had knelt beside her mother in church, and prayed that help and strength and courage should be given to them both. She had prayed for peace of mind and security, and she had asked that her mother might be spared to her wrong, and that the farm should prosper. For answer came sickness and poverty and death. She was alone now, caught in a mesh of brutality and crime, living beneath a roof she loathed, among people she despised, and she was walking out across a barren, friendless moor to meet a horse thief and a murderer of men. She would offer no prayers to God this Christmas. Mary waited on the high road above Rushford, In the distance she saw the little cavalcade approach her, the pony, the jingle, the two horses tethered behind. The driver raised his whip in a signal of welcome. Mary felt the color flame into her face and drain away. This weakness was a thing of torment to her, and she longed for it to be tangible and alive so she could tear it from her and trample it underfoot. She thrust her hands into her shawl and waited, her forehead puckered into a frown. He whistled as she approached her and flung a small package at her feet. "Ah, happy Christmas to you," he said. "I had a silver piece in my pocket yesterday, and it burned like a hole. There's a new handkerchief for your head." She had meant to be curt and silent on meeting him, but this introduction made it difficult to her. "That's very kind of you," she said. "I'm afraid you wasted your money all the same." "That doesn't worry me, I'm used to it," he told her, and he looked her up and down in the cool, offensive way of his, and whistled a tuneless song. "You were early here," he said. "Were you afraid I'd be going without you?" She climbed into the cart beside him and gathered the reins in her hands. "I like to have the feel of them again," she said, ignoring his remark. "Mother and we would drive into Helston once a week on market days. It all seems very long ago. I have a pain in my heart when I think of it. How we used to laugh together, even when times were bad. You wouldn't understand that, of course. You never cared for anything but yourself." He folded his arms and watched her handle the reins. "That pony would cross the moor blindfolded," he told her. "Give him his head, can't you? He's never stumbled in his life, that's better. He's taking charge of you, remember? And you can leave him to it. What were you saying?" Mary held the rein lightly in her hands and looked at the track ahead of her. "Nothing very much," she answered. "In a way I was talking to myself. So you're going to sell 2 ponies at the fair, then? Double profit, Mary Ellen. And you shall have a new dress if you help me. Don't smile and shrug your shoulder. I hate ingratitude. What's the matter with you today? Your color is gone and you've no light in your eyes. Are you feeling sick? Or have you pain in your belly?" "I've not been out of the house since I saw you last," she said. "I stayed up in my room with my thoughts. They didn't make cheerful company. I'm a deal older than I was 4 days ago." "I'm sorry you lost your looks," he went on. "I fancied jogging into Launceston with a pretty girl beside me, and fellows looking up as we passed and winking. You're drab today. Don't lie to me, Mary. I'm not as blind as you think. What's happened at Jamaica Inn?" "Nothing's happened," she said. "My aunt patters about in the kitchen, my uncle sits at the table with his head in his hands and a bottle of brandy in front of him. It's only myself that has changed." "You've had no more visitors, have you?" "None that I know of. Nobody's crossed the yard. Your mouth is set very firm, and there are smudges under your eyes. You're tired. I've seen a woman look like that before, and there was a reason for it. Her husband came back to her in Plymouth after 4 years at sea. You can't make that excuse. Have you been thinking about me, by any chance?" "Yes, I thought about you once," she said. Would hang I wondered who would hang first, you or your brother. There's little in it from what I can see." "If Joss hangs, it'll be his own fault," said Jim. "If ever a man puts a rope around his own neck, he does. He goes 3/4 the way to meet trouble. When it does get him, it will serve him right, and there'll be no brandy bottle to save him then. He'll swing sober." They jogged along in silence, Jim playing the thong of the whip, and Mary aware of his hands beside her. She glanced down at them out of the trail of her eye, and she saw they were long and slim. They had the same strength, same grace as his brothers. These attracted her, the others repelled her. She realized for the first time that aversion and attraction ran side by side, that the boundary line was thin between. The thought was an unpleasant one, and she shrank from it. Supposing this hand had been Joss beside her 10, 20 years ago. She shuddered the comparison at the back of her mind, tearing the picture it conjured. Fearing the picture it conjured. She knew now why she hated her uncle. His voice broke in upon her thoughts. "What are you looking at?" he said. She lifted her eyes to the scene in front of her. "I happened to notice your hands," she said briefly. "They are like your brother's. How far do we go across the moor?" Isn't that the high road, winding away yonder? We strike it lower down and miss 2 or 3 miles of it, so you notice a man's hands, do you? I should never have believed it of you. You're a woman after all, then, and not a half-fledged farm boy. Are you going to tell me why you've sat in your room for 4 days without speaking? Or do you want me to guess? Women love to be mysterious. There's no mystery in it. You asked me last time if we met if I knew why my aunt looked like a living ghost. Those were your words, weren't they? Well, I know now. That's all. Jim watched her with curious eyes, and then he whistled again. Drink's a funny thing, he said after a moment or two. I got drunk once, in Amsterdam, the time I ran away to sea. I remember hearing a church clock strike 9:30 in the evening, and I was sitting on the floor with my arms around a pretty-haired girl. Next thing I knew, it was 7 the following morning, and I was lying on my back in the gutter, without any boots or breeches. I often wonder what I did during those 10 hours. I thought and thought. I'd be darned if I could remember. That's very fortunate for you, said Mary. Your brother is not so lucky. When he gets drunk, he finds his memory instead of losing it. The pony slacked in his stride, and she flicked at him with the reins. If he's alone, he can talk to himself, she continued. It wouldn't have much effect on the walls of Jamaica Inn. This time he was not alone, though. I happened to be there when he woke from his stupor, and he'd been dreaming. And when you heard one of his dreams, you shut yourself up in your bedroom for 4 days, is that it? Said Jim. That's as near as you'll ever get to it, she replied. He leaned over her suddenly and took the reins out of her hands. You don't look where you're going, he said. I told you this pony never stumbled. It doesn't mean you have to drive him into a block of granite the size of a cannonball. Give him to me. She sank back in the jingle and allowed him to drive. It was true she had lacked concentration and deserved this reproach. The pony picked up his feet and broke into a trot. What are you going to do about it? Said Jim. Mary shrugged her shoulders. I haven't made up my mind, she said. I have to consider Aunt Patience. You don't expect me to tell you, do you? Why not? I hold no brief for Joss. You're his brother, and that's enough for me. There are many gaps in the story, and you fit remarkably well into some of them. Do you think I'd waste my time working for my brother? There'd be little waste of time, from what I've seen. There's profit enough and to spare in his business, and no payment in return for his goods. Dead men tell no tales, Jim Merlin. No, but dead ships do. And when they run ashore in the fair wind, it's lights a vessel looks for, Mary, when they're seeking harbor. Have you ever seen a moth flutter a candle and singe his wings? A ship will do the same to a false light. It may happen once, twice, 3 times perhaps, but the 4th time a dead ship stinks to heaven, the whole country is up in arms and wants to know the reason why. My brother has lost his own rudder by now, and he's heading for the shore himself. Will you keep him company? I? What have I to do with him? He can run his own head into the noose. I may have helped myself to baccy now and then, and I've run cargoes, but I'll tell you one thing, Mary Ellen, and you can believe it or not as the mood takes you. I've never killed a man yet. He cracked the whip savagely over his pony's head, and the animal broke into a gallop. There's a ford ahead of us where that hedge runs away to the east. We cross the river and come out onto Launceston Road half a mile on. Then we've 7 miles or more before we reach the town. Are you getting tired? She shook her head. There's bread and cheese in the basket under the seat, he said, and an apple or two and some pears. You'll be hungry directly. So you think I wreck ships, do you? And stand on the shore and watch men drown? And then put my hands into their pockets afterwards, when they're swollen with water? Makes a pretty picture. When his anger was pretended or sincere, she could not say, but his mouth was set firm, and there was a flaming spot of color high on his cheekbone. You haven't denied it yet, have you? She said. He looked down at her with insolence, half contemptuous, half amused, and he laughed as though she were a child without knowledge. She hated him for it, and with a sudden intuition she knew the question that was forming itself, and her hands grew hot. "If you believe it of me, why do you drive with me today to Launceston?" he said. He was ready to mock her. An evasion or a stammered reply would be a triumph for him, and she steeled herself to gaiety. "For the sake of your bright eyes, Jim Merlin," she said, "I ride with you for no other reason," and she met his glance without a tremor. He laughed at that and shook his head and fell to whistling again, and all at once there was an ease between them, and a certain boyish familiarity. The very boldness of her words had disarmed him. He suspected nothing of the weakness that lay behind them, and for the moment they were companions without strain of being man and woman. They came now to the high road, and the jingle rattled along behind the trotting pony, with the two stolen horses clattering in tow. The rain clouds swept across the sky, threatening and low, but as yet no drizzle came from them, and the hills that rose in the distance from the moors were clear of mist. Mary thought of Francis Day and Alternon away to the left of her, and she wondered what he would say to her when she told him her story. He would not advise a waiting game again. Perhaps he would not thank her if she broke in upon his Christmas, and she pictured the silent vicarage, peaceful and still among the cluster of cottages that formed the village, and the tall church tower standing like a guardian above the roofs and chimneys. There was a haven of rest for her in Alternon. The very name spelled like a whisper, and the voice of Francis Davy would mean security and forgetting trouble. There was a strangeness about him that was disturbing and pleasant. The picture he had painted, and the way he had driven his horse, and how he had waited upon her with deft silence. And strange above all was the grey and sombre stillness of his room that bore no trace of his personality. He was the shadow of a man, and now she was not with him. He lacked substance. He had not the male aggression of Jim beside her. He was without flesh and blood. He was no more than two white eyes and a voice in the darkness. The pony shied suddenly at the gap in the hedge, and Jim's loud curse woke her with a jar from the privacy of her thoughts. She threw a shot at a venture. "Are there churches hereabouts?" she asked him. "I've lived like a heathen these last months, and I hate the feeling." "Get out of it, you blasted fool, you!" shouted Jim, stabbing at the pony's mouth. "Do you want to land us all in the ditch? Churches, you say?" "How should I know about churches? I've only been inside one once, and then I was carried in my mother's arms, and I came out Jeremiah. I can't tell you anything about them. They keep the gold plate they keep the gold plates locked up, I believe." "There's a church at Alternon, isn't there?" she said. "That's within walking distance of Jamaica Inn. I might go there tomorrow." "Far better eat your Christmas dinner with me. I can't give you turkey, but I can always help myself to goose from old Farmer Tuckett at North Hill. He's getting so blind he'd never know she was missing. Do you know who has the living? Do you know who has the living at Alternoon, Jim Merlin?" "No, I do not, Mary Ellen. I've never had any truck with parsons, and I'm never likely to. They're a funny breed of man altogether. There was a parson at North Hill when I was a boy. He was very short-sighted, and they say one Sunday he mislaid the sacramental wine and gave the parish brandy instead. The village heard in a body what was happening, and do you know the church was so packed there was scarcely room to kneel. There were people standing up against the walls waiting for their turn. The parson couldn't make it out at all. There'd never been so many in his church before, and he got up in the pulpit with his eyes shining behind his spectacles, and he preached a sermon about the flock returning to the fold. Brother Matthew told me the story. He went up twice to the altar rails, and the person never noticed. It was a great day in North Hill. Get out the bread and cheese." "Mary, my belly is sinking away to nothing." Mary shook her head at him and sighed. "Have you ever been serious about anything in your life?" she said. "Do you respect nothing and nobody?" "I respect my inside," he told her, "and it's calling out for food. There's the box under my feet. You can eat the apple if you're feeling religious. There's an apple comes in the Bible, I know that much." It was a hilarious and rather heated cavalcade that clattered into Launceston at 2:30 in the afternoon. Mary had thrown trouble and responsibility to the winds, and in spite of her firm resolution of the early morning, she had melted into Jim's mood, and given herself to gaiety. Away from the shadow of Jamaica Inn, her natural youth and spirits returned, and her companion noticed this in a flash and played upon them. She laughed because she must, and because he made her, and there was an infection in the air caught from the sound and bustle of the town, a sense of excitement and well-being, a sense of Christmas. The streets were thronged with people, and the little shops were gay. Carriages and carts and coaches, too, were huddled together in a cobbled square. There was color and life and movement. The cheerful crowd jostled one another before the market stalls. Turkey and geese scratched the wooden barrier that pinned them, and a woman in a green cloak held apples above her head and smiled, the apples shining and red like her cheeks. The scene was familiar and dear. Halstead had been like this, year after year at Christmas time. But there was a brighter, more abandoned spirit about Launceston. The crowd was greater and the voices mixed. There was space here and a certain sophistication. Devonshire and England were across the river. Farmers from the next country rubbed shoulders with countrywomen from East Cornwall, and there were shopkeepers and pastry cooks and little apprentice boys who pushed in and out among the crowd with hot plates and sausage meat on trays. A lady in a feathered hat and a blue velvet cape stepped down from her coach and went into the warmth and light of the hospitable White Hart, followed by a gentleman in a padded greatcoat of powder gray. He lifted his eyeglass to his eyes, and strutted after her for all the world like a turkey-cock himself. This was a gay and happy world to Mary. The town was set on the bosom of a hill, with a castle framed in the centre like a tale from old history. There were trees clustered here in sloping fields, and water gleamed the valley below. The moors were remote, and they stretched away out of sight behind the town and were forgotten. Launceston had reality. These people were alive. Christmas came into its own again, in the town and had place among the cobbled streets. The laughing, jostling crowd and the watery sun struggled from his hiding place behind the grey-banked clouds to join festivity. Mary wore the handkerchief Jim had given her. She even unbent so far as to permit him to tie the ends under her chin. They had stabled the pony and jingle at the top of the town, and now Jim pushed his way through the crowd, leading his 2 stolen horses, Mary following at his heels. He led the way with confidence, making straight for the main square, where the whole of Launceston gathered, and the booths and tents of the Christmas fair stood end to end. There was a place roped off from the fair for the buying and selling of livestock, and the ring was surrounded by farmers and countrymen, gentlemen too, and dealers from Devon and beyond. Mary's heart beat faster as they approached the ring, supposing there was someone from North Hill here, or a farmer from a neighboring village. Surely they would recognize the horses. Jim wore his hat at the back of his head, and he whistled. He looked back at her once and winked his eye. The crowd parted and waved for them. Mary stood on the outskirts behind a fat market woman with a basket, and she saw Jim take his place among a group of men with ponies, and he nodded to one or two of them and ran his eye over their ponies, bidding as he did to a flare to light his pipe. He looked cool and unperturbed. Presently a flashy-looking fellow with a square hat and cream breeches thrust his way through the crowd and crossed over to the horses. His voice was loud and important, and he kept hitting his boot with a crop and then pointing to the ponies. From his tone and his air of authority, Mary judged him to be a dealer. Soon he was joined by a little lynx-eyed man in a black coat, who now and again jogged his elbow and whispered in his ear. Mary saw him stare hard at the black pony that had belonged to Squire Besot. He went up to him and bent down and felt his legs. Then he whispered something in the ear of the loud-voiced man. Mary watched him nervously. "Where'd you get this pony?" said the dealer, tapping Jim on the shoulder. "He was never bred on the moors, not with that head and shoulders." "He was foaled at Callington 4 years ago," said Jim carelessly, his pipe in the corner of his mouth. "I brought him as a yearling from old Tim Bray. You remember Tim? He sold up last year and went into Dorset. Tim always told me I'd get my money back on this pony. The dam was Irish bred, and won prizes for him up country. Have a look at him, won't you? He's not going cheap, I'll tell you that." He puffed at his pipe, and the two men went over to the pony carefully. The time seemed endless before they straightened themselves and stood back. "Had any trouble with his skin?" said the lynx-eyed man. It feels very coarse on the surface and sharp like bristles. There's a taint about him, too, I don't like. You haven't been doping him, have you? There's nothing ailing with that pony, replied Jim. The other one here. He fell away to nothing in the summer, but I brought him back all right. I'd do better to keep him till the spring now, I believe, and he's costing me money. Now this black pony here, you can't fault him. I'll be frank with you over one thing, and it's only fair to admit. Old Tim Bray never knew the mare was in a foal. He was in Plymouth at the time, and his boy was looking after her, and when he found out he gave the boy a thrashing. But of course it was too late. He had to make the best of a bad job. It's my opinion the sire was a gray. Look at the short hair there, close to the skin. That's gray, isn't it? Tim just missed a good bargain with his pony. Look at those shoulders. There's breeding for you. I'll tell you what, I'll take 18 guineas for him. The lynx-eyed man shook his head, but the dealer hesitated. Make it 15 and we might do business, he suggested. No, 18 guineas is my sum, and not a penny less, said Jim. The two men consulted together and appeared to disagree. Mary heard the word fake, and Jim shot a glance at her, at the heads of the crowd. A little murmur rose from the group of men beside him. Once more the lynx-eyed man bent and touched the legs of the black pony. I advise another opinion on this pony, he said. I'm not satisfied about him myself. Where's your mark? Jim showed him the narrow slit in the ear, and the man examined it closely. You're a sharp customer, aren't you? Said Jim. Anyone would think I'd stolen a horse. Anything wrong with the mark? No, apparently not, but it's a good thing for you that Tim Brady has gone to Dorset. He'd never own this pony, whatever you like to say. I wouldn't touch him, Stevens, if I were you. You'll find yourself in trouble. Come away, man. The loud-voiced dealer looked regretfully at the black pony. He's a good looker, he said. I don't care who bred him, or if his sire was piebald. What makes you so particular, Will? Once more the lynx-eyed man puckered at his plucked at his sleeve and whispered in his ear. The dealer listened and pulled a face and then nodded. All right, he said aloud. I've no doubt you're right. You've got an eye for trouble, haven't you? Perhaps we'd better get out of it. You can keep your pony, he added to Jim. My partner doesn't fancy him. Take my advice and come down on your price. If you have him for long on your hands, you'll be sorry. And he elbowed his way through the crowd and the lynx-eyed man beside him, and they disappeared in the direction of the White Hart. Mary breathed a sigh of relief when she saw the last of them. She could make nothing of Jim's expression. His lips were framed in the inevitable whistle. People came and went. The shaggy moorland ponies were sold for £2 or £3 apiece, and their late owners departed satisfied. No one came near the black pony again. He was looked at askance by the crowd. At 3:45 Jim sold the other horse for £6 to a cheerful, honest-looking farmer. After a long and very good-humoured argument, the farmer declared he would give £5, and Jim stuck out for 7. After 20 minutes' riotous bargaining, the sum of £6 was agreed, and the farmer rode off on the back of his purchase with a grin from ear to ear. Mary began to flag on her feet. Twilight gathered in the market square, and the lamps were lit. The town wore an air of mystery. She was thinking of returning to the jingle when she heard a woman's voice behind her, and a high, affected laugh. She turned and saw the blue cloak and the plumed hat of a woman who had stepped from the coach earlier in the afternoon. "Oh, look, James," she was saying. "Did you ever see such a delicious pony in your life? He holds his head just like poor Beauty did. His likeness would be quite striking, only this animal, of course, is black, and has nothing of Beauty's breeding. What a nuisance Roger isn't here. I can't disturb him from this meeting. What do you think of him, James?" Her companion put up his eyeglass and stared. "Darn it, Maria," he drawled. "I don't know a thing about horses. The pony you lost was a gray, wasn't it? This thing is ebony. Positively ebony, my dear. Do you want to buy him?" The woman gave a little trill of laughter. "It will be such a good Christmas present for the children," she said. "They've plagued poor Roger ever since Beauty disappeared. Ask the price, James, will you?" The man strutted forward. "Here, my good fellow," he called to Jim. "Do you want to sell that black pony of yours?" Jim shook his head. "He's promised to a friend," he said. "I wouldn't like to go back on my word. Besides, this pony wouldn't carry you. He's been ridden by children." "Oh, really? Oh, I see. Oh, thank you. Maria, this fellow says the pony is not for sale. Is he sure? What a shame. I'd set my heart on him. I'll pay him his price. Tell him. Ask him again, James?" Once more the man put up his glass and drawled, "Look here, my man, this lady has taken a fancy to your pony. She just lost one, and she wants to replace him. Her children will be most disappointed if they hear about it. Darn your friend, you know. You must wait. What's your price?" "25 guineas," said Jim promptly. "At least, that's what my friend was going to pay. I'm not anxious to sell him." The lady in the plumed hat swept into the ring. "I'll give you 30 for him," she said. "I'm Miss Bassett from North Hill, and I want the pony as a Christmas present for my children. Please don't be obstinate. I have half the sum in my purse, and this gentleman will give you the rest. Mr. Bassett is in Launceston now, and I want the pony to be a surprise to him as well as to my children. My groom shall fetch the pony immediately and ride him to North Hill before Mr. Bassett leaves the town. Here's the money." Jim swept his hat and bowed low. "Thank you, madame," he said. "I hope Mr. Bassett will be pleased with your bargain. You will find the pony exceedingly safe with the children." "Oh, I'm certain he will be delighted. Of course the pony is nothing like the one that was stolen. Beauty was a thoroughbred, and worth a great deal of money. This little animal is handsome enough, and will please the children. Come along, James. It's getting quite dark, and I'm chilled to the bone." She made her way from the ring towards the coach that waited in the square. The tall footman leaped forward to open the door. "I've just bought a pony for Master Robert and Master Henry," she said. "Will you find Richards and tell him he's to ride it back home? I want it to be a surprise to the squire." She stepped into the coach, her petticoats fluttering behind her, followed her companion with a monocle. Jim looked hastily over his shoulder and tapped the lad who stood behind him on the arm. "Here," he said, "would you like a 5-shilling piece?" The lad nodded, his mouth agape. "Hang on to this pony, then, and when the groom comes for him, hand him over for me, will you? I've just had word that my wife has given birth to twins, and her life is in danger. I haven't a moment to lose. Here, take the bridle. A happy Christmas to you." And he was off in a moment, walking hard across the square, his hands thrust deep in his breeches pockets. Mary followed a discreet 10 paces behind. Her face was scarlet, and she kept her eyes on the ground. The laughter bubbled up inside her, and she hid her mouth in her shawl. She was near to collapsing when they reached the further side of the square, out of sight of the coach or the group of people, and she stood with her hand to her side, catching her breath. Jim waited for her, his face as grave as a judge. "Jim Merlin, you deserve to be hanged," she said, when she had recovered herself. "To stand there, as you did, in the market square, and sell that stolen pony back to Miss Bassett herself. You have the cheek of the devil, and the hairs of my head have gone gray from watching you." He threw back his head and laughed, and she could not resist them. Their laughter echoed in the street until people turned to look at them, and they too caught the infection and smiled and broke into laughter, and Launceston itself seemed to rock with merriment as peal after peal of gaiety echoed in the street, mingling with the bustle and clatter of the fair, and with it all there was shouting and calling and song from somewhere. The torches and flares cast strange lights on the faces of people, and there was color and shadow and the hum of voices and a ripple of excitement in the air. Jim caught at her hand and crumbled the fingers. "You're glad you came now, aren't you?" he said. And yes, she said recklessly, and she did not mind. They plunged into the thick of the fair, with all the warmth and suggestion of packed humanity about them. Jim bought Mary a crimson shawl and gold rings for her ears. They sucked oranges beneath a striped tent, and had their fortunes told by a wrinkled gypsy woman. "Beware of a dark stranger," she said to Mary, and they looked at one another and laughed again. "There's blood in your hand, young man," she told him. "You'll kill a man one day." And what did I tell you about the jingle this morning? Said Jim. I'm innocent as yet. Do you believe it now? But she shook her head at him, and she would not say. Little raindrops splashed into their faces, and they did not care. The wind rose in gusts and billowed the fluttering tints, scattering paper and ribbons and silks, and a great striped roof shuddered an instant and crumpled, while apples and oranges rolled into the gutter. Flares streamed in the wind, and rain fell, and people ran hither and thither for shelter, laughing and calling to one another, the rain streaming from them. Jim dragged Mary under the cover of a doorway, his arms around her shoulders, and face he turned her face against him, and held her with his hands and kissed her. Beware of the dark stranger, he said, and he laughed and kissed her again. The night clouds had come up with the rain, and it was black in an instant. The wind blew out the flares, and the lanterns glowed dim and yellow, and the bright color of the fair was gone. The square was soon deserted. The striped tents in the booths gaped empty and forlorn. The soft rain came in gusts at the open doorway, and Jim stood with his back to the weather, making a screen for Mary. He untied the handkerchief she wore, and played with her hair. She felt the tips of his fingers on her neck, traveling to her shoulders, and she put her hands and pushed him away. I've made a fool of myself long enough for one night, Jim Merlin, she said. It's time we thought of returning. Let me alone. You don't want to ride in an open jingle in this wind, do you? He said. It's coming from the coast and will be blown under on the high ground. We'll have to spend the night together in Launceston. Very likely. Go and fetch your pony, Jim, while this shower lifts for the moment. I'll wait for you here. Don't be a Puritan, Mary. You'll be soaked to the skin on the Bodmin Road. Pretend you're in love with me, can't you? You'd stay with me then. Are you talking to me like this because I'm the barmaid at Jamaica Inn? Darn Jamaica Inn, I like the look of you and the feel of you, and that's enough for any man. It ought to be enough for a woman, too. I dare say it is for some. I don't happen to be made that way. Do they make you different from other women, then, down in Helford River? Stay here with me tonight, Mary, and we can find out. You'd be like the rest by the time morning came. I'd take my oath on that. I haven't a doubt of it. That's why I'd rather risk soaking in the jingle. You're as hard as flint, Mary Ellen. You'll be sorry for it when you're alone again. Better be sorry than later. If I kissed you again, would you change your mind? I would not. Don't wonder my brother to I don't wonder my brother took to his bed and his bottle for a week with you in the house. Did you sing psalms to him? I dare say I did. I've never known a woman so perverse. I'll buy a ring for you if it would make you feel respectable. It's not often I have money enough in my pocket to make the offer. How many wives do you belong to have? 6 or 7 scattered over Cornwall. I don't count the ones across tomorrow. That's a good number for one man. I'd wait a while before I took on an eighth if I were you. You're sharp, aren't you? You look like a monkey in that shawl of yours with your bright eyes. All right, I'll fetch the jingle and take you home to your aunt. But I'll kiss you first whether you like it or not. He took her face in his hands. One for sorrow, two for joy, he said. I'll give you the rest when you're in a more yielding frame of mind. I wouldn't do to finish It wouldn't do to finish the run tonight. Stay where you're to. I'll not be long. He bowed his head against the rain and strode across the street. She saw him disappear behind a line of stalls and so around the corner. She leaned back once more within the shelter of the door. It would be desolate enough on the high road, and she knew that. This was a real driving rain with a venomous wind behind it, and there would be little mercy for the moors. It required a certain amount of courage to stand those 11 miles in an open jingle. The thought of staying in Launceston with Jim Merlin made her heart beat faster, perhaps, and it was exciting to think upon it now he was gone, and he could not see her face, but for all that she would not lose her head and please him. Once she had departed from the line of conduct she had laid down for herself, there would be no returning. There would be no privacy of mind, no independence. She had given too much away as it was, and she would never entirely be free of him again. This weakness would be a drag on her and make the four walls of Jamaica Inn more hateful than they were already. It was better to bear solitude alone. Now the silence of the moors would be a torment because of his presence 4 miles distant from her. Mary wrapped her shawl around her and folded her arms. She wished that women were not the frail things of straw she believed them to be. Then she could stay this night with Jim Merlin and forget herself as he could forget, and both of them part with a laugh and a shrug of the shoulder in the morning. But she was a woman, and it was impossible. A few kisses had made a fool of her already. She thought of Aunt Patience, trailing like a ghost in the shadow of her master, and she shuddered. That would be Mary Gellen too, but for the grace of God and her own strength of will. A gust of wind tore at her skirt, and another shower of rain blew in at the open doorway. It was louder now. It was colder now. Puddles ran on the cobbled stones, and the lights and the people had vanished. Launceston had lost its glamour. It would be a bleak and cheerless Christmas Day tomorrow. Mary waited, stamping her feet and blowing upon her hands. Jim was taking his own time to fetch the jingle. He was annoyed with her, no doubt, for refusing to stay, and leaving her to become wet and chilled in the open doorway was to be his method of punishment. The long minutes passed, and still he did not come. If this was his system of revenge, the plan was without humor and lacked originality. Somewhere a clock struck 8. He had been gone over half an hour, and the place where the pony and Jingle were stabled, was only 5 minutes away. Mary was dispirited and tired. She had been on her legs since the early afternoon, and now that the high pitch of excitement had died away, she wanted to rest. It would be difficult to recapture the carelessness, irresponsible mood of the last few hours. Jim had taken his gaiety with him. At last Mary could stand it no longer, and she set off up the hill in search of him. The long street was deserted, save for a few stragglers who hung about in the doubtful shelter of the doorways as she had done. The rain was pitiless, and the wind came in gusts. There was nothing left now of the Christmas spirit. In a few minutes she came to the stable where they had left the pony and Jingle in the afternoon. The door was locked, and peering through a crack she saw that the shed was empty. Jim must have gone then. She knocked at the little shop next door, in a fever of impatience, and after a little while it was opened by the fellow who had admitted them to his shed earlier in the day. He looked annoyed at being disturbed from the comfort of his fire, and for the first he did not recognize her, wild as she was in her wet shawl. "What do you want?" he said. "We don't give food to strangers here." "I haven't come for food," Mary replied. "I'm looking for my companion. We came here together with a pony and a Jingle, if you remember. I see the stable is empty. Have you seen him?" The man muttered an apology. "You'll excuse me, I'm sure. Your friend has been gone 20 minutes or more. He seemed in a great hurry, and there was another man with him. I wouldn't be sure, but he looked like one of those servants from the White Hart. They turned back in that direction at any rate." "He left no message, I suppose?" "No, I'm sorry, he did not." "Maybe you'll find him at the White Hart. Do you know where he is?" "Yes, thank you. I'll try there. Good night." The man shut the door in her face, glad enough to be rid of her, and Mary retraced her steps in the direction of the town. What should Jem want with one of the servants from the White Hart? The man must have been mistaken. There was nothing for it but to find out the truth for herself. Once more she came to the cobbled square. The White Hart looked hospitable enough, with its lighted windows, but there was no sign of the pony and Jingle. Mary's heart sank. Surely Jim had not taken the road without her? She hesitated for a moment, and then she went up to the door and passed inside. The hall seemed to be full of gentlemen, talking and laughing, and once again her country clothes and wet hair caused consternation, for a servant went up to her at once and bade her begone. "I've come in search of Mr. Jim Merlin," said Mary firmly. "He came here with a pony and a Jingle, and was seen with one of your servants. I'm sorry to trouble you, but I'm anxious to find him. Will you please make me some inquiry?" The man went off with an ill grace. while Mary waited by the entrance, turning her back on the little group of men who stood by the fire and stared. Among them she recognized the dealer and the little lynx-eyed man. She was aware of a sudden sense of foreboding. In a few moments the servant returned with a tray of glasses, which he distributed among the company by the fire, and later he appeared again with the cake and ham. He took no more notice of Mary, and only when she called to him for the third time did he come towards her. "I'm sorry," he said. "We've plenty here tonight without wasting our time over people from the fair. There's no man here by the name of Merlin. I've asked outside. Nobody had heard of him." Mary turned at once for the door, but the lynx-eyed man was there before her. "If it's the dark gypsy fellow who tried to sell my partner a pony this afternoon, I can tell you about him," he said, smiling wide, and showing a row of broken teeth. Laughter broke out from the group by the fire. She looked from one to the other. "What have you to say?" she said. "He was in the company of a gentleman barely 10 minutes ago," returned the lynx-eyed man, still smiling and looking her up and down, "and with the help of some of us he was persuaded to enter a carriage that was waiting at the door. He was inclined to resist us at first, but a look from the gentleman appeared to decide him. No doubt you know what became of the black pony. The price he was asking was undoubtedly high." His remark brought forth a fresh burst of laughter from the group by the fire. Mary stared steadily at the lynx-eyed man. "Do you know where he went?" she asked. He shrugged his shoulders and pulled a mock face of pity. "His destination is unknown to me," he said, "and I regret to say that your companion left no message of farewell. However, it is Christmas Eve, the night is young yet, and you can see for yourself it's no weather to remain outside. If you care to wait here until your friend chooses to return, myself and the rest of these gentlemen will be delighted to entertain you." He laid a limp hand on her shawl. "What a blackguard the fellow must be to desert you," he said smoothly. "Come in and rest, and forget him." Mary turned her back on him without a word and pressed out through the door once more. As it closed behind her, she caught the echo of his laughter. She stood in the deserted market square with the gusty wind and the scattered showers of rain for company. So the worst had happened, and the theft of the pony had been discovered. There was no other explanation. Jim had gone. Stupidly she stared before her at the dark houses, wondering what was the punishment for theft. Did they hang men for that as well as murder? She felt ill in body, as though someone had beaten her, and her brain was in confusion. She could see nothing clearly. She could make no plans. She supposed that Jim was lost to her now anyway, and she would never see him again. The brief adventure was over. For the moment she was stunned and hardly knowing what she did, so she began to walk aimlessly across the square towards the castle hill. If she had consented to stay in Launceston, this would never have happened. They would have gone from the shelter of the doorway and found a room in the town somewhere. She would have been beside him, and they would have loved one another. And even if he had been caught in the morning, they would have had those hours alone, now that he was gone from her. Mind and body cried out in the bitterness and resentment, and she knew how much she had wanted him. It was her fault that she had been taken. Her fault that he had been taken, and she could do nothing for him. No doubt they would hang him for this. He would die like his father before him. The castle wall frowned down upon her, and the rain ran in rivulets beside the road. There was no beauty left in Launceston any more. It was a grim, grey, hateful place, and every bend in the road hinted at disaster. She stumbled along with the mizzling rain driving in her face, caring little where she went, and careless of the fact that 11 long miles lay between her and a bedroom at Jamaica Inn. If loving a man meant this pain and anguish and sickness, she wanted none of it. It did away with sanity and composure, and made havoc of courage. She was a babbling child now, when once she would have been indifferent and strong. The steep hill rose before her. They had clattered down it in the afternoon. She remembered the gnarled tree trunk at the gap in the hedge. Jim had whistled, and she had sung snatches of song. Suddenly she came to her senses and faltered in her steps. It was madness to walk any further. The road stretched like a white ribbon in front of her, and 2 miles of it would bring exhaustion in this wind and rain. She turned again on the slope of the hill, with the winking lights of the town beneath her. Someone, perhaps, would give her a bed for the night or a blanket on the floor. She had no money. They would have to trust her for payment. The wind tore at her hair, and the small, stunted trees bowed and curtsied before it. It would be a wild, wet dawn to Christmas Day. She went away down the road, driven like a leaf before the wind, and out of the darkness she saw a carriage crawling up the hill towards her. It looked like a beetle, stubby and black, and its progress was slow, with the full force of the weather against it. She watched it with dull eyes. The sight conveyed no message to her brain except that somewhere on an unknown road Jim Merlin travelled to his death, perhaps by the same manner. The carriage had crept up to her and was passing by before she ran towards it on an impulse, and called to the driver wrapped in a great coat on the seat. "Are you taking the Bodmin road?" she cried. "Have you a passenger inside?" The driver shook his head and whipped on his horse. But before Mary could step aside, an arm came out of the carriage window, and a hand was laid on her shoulder. "What does Mary Yellen do alone in Launceston on Christmas Eve?" said a voice from within. The hand was firm, but the voice was gentle. A pale face stared at her from the dark interior of the carriage. White hair and white eyes beneath the black shovel hat. It was the vicar of Alternoon. "I'll be right back." Okay. Ten. She watched his profile in the half-light. Sharp it was and clear, the prominent thin nose thrust downward like the curved beak of a bird. His lips were narrow and colorless, pressed firm together, and he leaned forward with his chin resting on a long ebony cane that he held between his knees. For the moment she could see nothing of his eyes. They were veiled by the short white lashes. And then he turned in his seat and considered her, his lashes fluttering, and the eyes that looked upon her were white also, transparent and expressionless as glass. "So we ride together for the second time," he said, and his voice was soft and low, like the voice of a woman. "Once more I have the good fortune to help you by the wayside. You are wet through to the skin. You had better take off your clothes." He stared at her with cold indifference, and she struggled in some confusion with the pin that clasped her shawl. "There is a dry rug here that will serve you for the rest of the journey," he continued. "As for your feet, they will be better bare. This carriage is comparatively free from draught." Without a word she slipped out of her soaking shawl and bodice and wrapped herself in the coarse hair blanket that he held out to her. Her hair fell from its band and hung like a curtain about her bare shoulders. She felt like a child that had been caught in an escapade, and now sat with hands folded meekly together, obedient to the master's word. "Well?" he said, looking gravely upon her, and she found herself at once stumbling into an explanation of her day. As before at Alternan, there was something about him that made her untrue to herself, made her sound like a fool and an ignorant country girl. For her story was poor telling, and she came out of it badly, just another woman who had cheapened herself at Launceston Fair, and had been left by the man of her choice to find her way home alone. She was ashamed to mention Jim by name, and she introduced him lamely as a man who lived by breaking horses, and whom she had met once when wandering on the moor. And now there had been some trouble in Launceston over the sale of the pony, and she feared he had been caught in some dishonesty. She wondered what Francis Davy must think of her riding to Launceston with a casual acquaintance, and then losing her companion in disgrace, and running about the town bedraggled and wet after nightfall like a woman of the streets. He heard her to the end of in silence, and she heard him swallow once or twice, a trick she remembered. "So you have not been too lonely after all," he said at length. "Jamaica Inn was not so isolated as you supposed." Mary flushed in the darkness, and though he could not see her face, she knew that his eyes were upon her, and she felt guilty, as though she had done wrong, and this was an accusation. "What was the name of your companion?" he asked quietly, and she hesitated a moment, awkward and uncomfortable, her sense of guilt stronger than ever. "He was my uncle's brother," she replied, aware of the reluctance in her voice, the admission dragging from her like a confession. Whatever his opinion of her had been hitherto, he was unlikely to raise it after this. Barely a week had passed since she had called Joss Merlin a murderer, and yet she had ridden from Jamaica Inn with his brother without compunction, a common barmaid who would see the fun and fair. "You think ill of me, of course," she went on hurriedly, "mistrusting and loathing my uncle as I do. It was hardly in keeping to make a confidant of his brother. He is dishonest and a thief, I know that. He told me as much in the beginning, but beyond that," her words trailed off with some uncertainty. After all, Jim had denied nothing. He had made little or no attempt to defend himself when she accused him, and now she ranged herself on his side. She defended him instead, without reason and against her sane judgment, bound to him already because of his hands upon her and kiss in the dark. "You mean the brother knows nothing of the landlord's trade by night?" continued the gentle voice at her side. "He is not of the company who brings the wagons to Jamaica Inn?" Mary made a little gesture of despair. "I don't know," she said. "I have no proof. He admits nothing. He shrugs his shoulders. But he told me one thing, that he had never killed a man, and I believed him. I still believe him. He also said that my uncle was running straight into the hands of the law, and they would catch him before long. He surely would not say that if he was one of the company." She spoke now to reassure herself rather than the man at her side, and Jim's innocence became suddenly of vital importance. "You told me before you had some acquaintance with the squire," she said quickly. "Perhaps you have influence with him too. You could no doubt persuade him to deal mercifully with Jim Merlin when the time comes. After all, he is young. He could start life afresh. It would be easy enough for you in your position." His silence was an added humiliation, and feeling those cold white eyes upon her, she knew what a little graceless fool he must think of her, and how feminine. He must see that she was pleading for a man who had kissed her once, and that he despised her went without saying. "My acquaintance with Mr. Bassat of North Hill is of the slightest," he told her gently. "Once or twice we have given one another good afternoon, and we have spoken of matters relating to our respective parishes. It is hardly likely that he should spare a thief because of me, especially if the thief is guilty and happens to be the brother of the landlord of Jamaica Inn." Mary said nothing. Once again the strange man of God had spoken words of logic and wisdom, and there was no argument in reply. But she was caught in the sudden fever of love that devastates reason and makes havoc of logic. Therefore his words acted as an irritant and created fresh turmoil in her brain. "You appear anxious for his safety," he said, and she wondered whether it was mockery she heard in his voice, or reproof, or understanding. But quickly as a flash of lightning he continued, "And if your new friend was guilty of other things, of conspiring with his brother against the belongings and perhaps the lives of his fellow men, what then, Mary Yellen? Would you still seek to save him?" She felt his hand upon hers, cool and impersonal, and because she was on edge after the excitement of the day, and was both frightened and frustrated in one, and loved a man against her judgment who was now lost to her through her own fault, she broke down and began to rave like a child deprived. "I didn't bargain for this," she said fiercely. "I could face the brutality of my uncle, and the pathetic dumb stupidity of Aunt Patience. Even the silence and the horror of Jamaica Inn itself could be boring without the shrinking and running away. I don't mind being lonely. There's a certain grim satisfaction in this struggle with my uncle that emboldens me at times, and I feel I'll have the better of him in the long run, whatever he says or does. I'd planned to take my aunt away from him and see justice done, and then, when it was all over, to find work on a farm somewhere, and live a man's life like I used to. But now I can't look ahead any more. I can't make plans or think for myself, or I go round and round in a trap, all because of a man I despise who has nothing to do with my brain or my understanding. I don't want to love like a woman or feel like a woman, Mr. Davy. There's pain that way, and suffering and misery that can last a lifetime. I didn't bargain for this. I don't want it." She leaned back, her face against the side of the carriage, worn out by her torrent of words and already ashamed of her outburst. She did not care what he thought of her now. He was a priest and therefore detached from her little world of storm and passion. He could have no knowledge of these things. She felt sullen and unhappy. "How old are you?" he asked abruptly. 23, she told him. She heard him swallow in the darkness, and taking his hand away from hers, he placed it once more upon the ebony stick and sat in silence. The carriage inclined away from Launceston Valley and the shelter of the hedges, and was now upon the high ground leading to the open moorland, exposed by the full force of the wind and rain. The wind was continuous, but the showers were intermittent, and now and again a wild star struggled furtively below behind a low sweeping cloud, and hung for an instant like a pinprick of light. Then it would go, obscured and swept away by a black curtain of rain, and from the narrow window of the carriage nothing could be seen but the square dark patch of sky. In the valley the rain had fallen with greater steadiness, and the wind, though persistent, had been moderate enough and straight, and checked its passage by the trees and the contour of the hill. Here on the high ground there was no such natural shelter. There was nothing but the moor on either side of the road, and above, the great black vault of the sky, and there was a scream in the wind that had not been there before. Mary shivered and edged closer to her companion like a dog to his fellow. Still he said nothing, and she knew that he had turned and was looking down upon her, and for the first time she was aware of his proximity as a person. She could feel his breath on her forehead. She remembered that her wet shawl and bodice lay on the floor at her feet, and she was naked under her rough blanket. When he spoke again, she realized how near he was to her, and his voice came as a shock, confusing suddenly and unexpected. "You are very young, Mary Ellen," he said softly. "You are nothing but a chicken with the broken shell still around you. You'll come through your little crisis. Women like you have no need to shed tears over a man encountered once or twice. And the first kiss is not a thing that is remembered. You will forget your friend with his stolen pony very soon. Come now, dry your eyes. You are not the first to bite your nails over a lost lover." He made light of her problem and counted it as a thing of no account. That was her first reaction to his words. And then she wondered why he had not used the conventional phrases of comfort, said something about the blessing of prayer, the peace of God, the life everlasting. She remembered that last ride with him, when he had whipped his horse into a fever of speed, and how he had crouched in his seat with the reins in his hands, and he had whispered words under his breath she had not understood. Again she felt something of the same discomfort she had experienced then, a sensation of uneasiness that she connected instinctively with his freak hair and eyes, as though his physical departure from normality was a barrier between him and the rest of the world. In the animal kingdom, a freak was a thing of abhorrence, at once hunted and destroyed or driven out into the wilderness. No sooner had she thought of this than she reproached herself as a narrow and unchristian. He was a fellow creature and a priest of God, but as she murmured an apology to him for having made a fool of herself before him, and talking like a common girl from the streets, she reached for her clothes and began to draw them on furtively under the cover of the blanket. "So I was right in my surmise, and all has been quiet at Jamaica Inn since I saw you last?" he said after a while, following some train of thought. "There have been no wagons to disturb your beauty sleep, and the landlord has played alone with his glass and his bottle?" Mary, still fretful and anxious, with her mind on the man she had lost, brought herself back to reality with an effort. She had forgotten her uncle nearly 10 hours. At once she remembered the full horror of the past week, and the new knowledge that had come to her. She thought of the interminable sleepless nights, the long days she had spent alone, and the staring bloodshot eyes of her uncle swung before her again, his drunken smile, his groping hands. "Mr. Davy," she whispered, Have you ever heard of wreckers? She had never said the word aloud before. She had not considered it even, and now that she heard it from her own lips, it sounded fearful and obscene like a blasphemy. It was too dark in the carriage to see the effect upon his face, but she heard him swallow. His eyes were hidden from her under the black shovel hat, and she could only see the dim outline of his profile, the sharp chin, the prominent nose. Once, years ago, when I was hardly more than a child, I heard a neighbor speak of them, she said, and then later, when I was old enough to understand, there were rumors of these things, snatches of gossip quickly suppressed. One of the men would bring back some wild tale after a visit to the north coast, and he would be silenced at once. Such talk was forbidden by the older men. It was an outrage to decency. I believed none of these stories. I asked my mother, and she told me they were horrible inventions of evil-minded people. Such things did not and could not exist. She was wrong. I now know she was wrong, Mr. Davy. My uncle is one of them. He told me so himself. Still her companion made no reply. He sat motionless like a stone thing, and she went on again, never raising her voice above a whisper. They are in it, every one of them, from the coast to the Tamar bank. All those men I saw that first Saturday in the bar at the inn. The gypsies, poachers, sailors, the peddler with the broken teeth. They've murdered women and children with their own hands. They've held them under the water. They've killed them with rocks and stones. Those are death wagons that travel the road by night, and the goods they carry are not smuggled casks alone, with brandy for some and tobacco for another, with the full cargoes of wrecked ships, bought at the price of blood, and the trust and possession of murdered men. And that's why my uncle is feared and loathed by the timid people in the cottages and farms, and why all the doors are barred against him, and why the coaches drive past his house in a cloud of heat dust. They suspect what they cannot prove. My aunt lives in a mortal terror of discovery, and my uncle has only to lose himself and drink before a stranger, and the secret is spilt to the four winds. There, Mr. Davy, now you know the truth about Jamaica Inn. She leaned back, breathless, against the side of the carriage, biting her lips and twisting her hands in an emotion she could not control, exhausted and shaken by the torrent of words that had escaped her, and somewhere in the dark places of her mind an image fought for recognition and found its way into the light, having no mercy on her feelings. And it was the face of Jim Merlin, the man she loved, grown evil and distorted, merging horribly and finally into one of his brother. The face beneath the black shovel hat turned toward her. She caught a sudden flicker of the white lashes, and the lips moved. "So the landlord talks when he is drunk?" he said, and it seemed to Mary that his voice lacked something of its usual gentle quality. It rang sharper in tone, as though pitched on a higher note, and when she looked up at him his eyes stared back at her, cold and impersonal as ever. "He talks, yes," she answered him. "When my uncle has lived on brandy for 5 days, he'll bare his soul before the world. He told me so himself the very first evening I arrived. He was not drunk then, but 4 days ago, when he had woken from his first stupor, he came out into the kitchen after midnight, swaying on his 2 feet. He talked then. That's why I know. And that's perhaps why I've lost faith in humanity and in God and in myself, and why I acted like a fool today in Launceston." The gale had increased in force during their conversation, and now at the bend of the road the carriage headed straight into the wind and was brought almost to a standstill. The vehicle rocked on its high wheels, and a sudden shower spattered against the windows like a handful of pebbles. There was not a particle of shelter now. The moor on either hand was bare and unprotected, and the scurrying clouds flew faster over the land, tearing themselves asunder on the shores. There is a salt wet tang in the wind that had come from the sea 15 miles away. Francis Davy leaned forward in his seat. "We are approaching 5 lanes, and the turning to Altrincham," he said. "The driver is bound to Bodmin, and will take you to Jamaica Inn. I shall leave you at 5 lanes, and walk down into the village. Am I the only man you have honoured with your confidence, or do I share it with the landlord's brother?" Again Mary could not tell if there was irony or mockery in his voice. "Jim Merlin knows," she said unwillingly. "We spoke of it this morning. He said little, though, and I know he is not friendly with my uncle. Anyway, it doesn't matter now. Jim rides to custody for another crime. And suppose he could save his own skin by betraying his brother, what then?" Mary yelled. There is consideration for you." He started. This was a new possibility, and for a moment she clutched at the straw. But the Vicar of Altrincham must have read her thoughts, for glancing up at him for confirmation of her hopes, she saw him smile, the thin line of his mouth breaking for a moment out of passivity, as though his face were as a mask and the mask had cracked. She looked away, uncomfortable, feeling the one who stumbles unawares upon a sight forbidden. "That would be a relief to you and him, no doubt," continued the vicar, "if he had never been involved. But there is always the doubt, isn't there? And neither you nor I know the answer to the question. A guilty man does not usually tie the rope around his own neck." Mary made a helpless movement with her hands, and he must have seen the despair in her face. For his voice became gentle again that had been harsh hitherto, and he laid his hand on her knee. "Our bright days are gone, and we are for the dark," he said softly. "If it were permitted to take our text from Shakespeare, there would be strange sermons preached in Cornwall tomorrow, Mary Ellen. Your uncle and his companions are not members of my congregation, however, and if they would not understand me. You shake your head at me. I speak in riddles. This man is no comforter, you say. He is a freak with his white hair and eyes. Don't turn away. I know what you think. I will tell you one thing for consolation, and you can make of it what you will. A week from now will bring the new year. The false lights have flickered for the last time, and there will be no more wrecks. The candles will be blown." "I don't understand you," said Mary. "How did you know this, and what has the new year to do with it?" He took his hand from her and began to fasten his coat preparatory to departure. He lifted the sash of the window and called to the driver to rein in his horse, and the cold air rushed into the carriage with a sting of frozen rain. "I returned tonight from a meeting in Launceston," he said, "which was but a sequel to many other similar meetings during the past few years, and those of us present were informed at last that His Majesty's Government were prepared to take certain steps during the coming year to patrol the coasts of His Majesty's country. There will be watchers on the cliffs instead of flares, and the paths known only at present to men like your uncle and his companions will be trodden by officers of the law. There will be a chain across England, Mary, that will be very hard to break. Now do you understand?" He opened the door of the carriage and stepped out into the road. He bared his head under the rain, and he saw the thick white hair frame his face like a halo. He smiled again to her and bowed, and reached for her hand once more, and held it a moment. "Your troubles are over," he said. "The wagon wheels will rest and the barred room at the end of the passage can be turned into a parlor. Your aunt will sleep in peace again, and your uncle will either drink himself to death and be a riddance to all of you, or he will turn Wesleyan and preach to travelers on the high road. As for you, you will ride south again and find a lover. Sleep well tonight. Tomorrow is Christmas Day, and the bells to Alternon will be ringing for peace and goodwill. I shall think of you." He waved his hand to the driver, and the carriage went on without him. Mary leaned out of the window to call to him, but he turned to the right down one of the 5 lanes and was already lost to sight. The carriage rattled on along Bodmin Road. There were still 3 miles to cover before the tall chimneys of Jamaica Inn broke upon the skyline, and those miles were the wildest and the most exposed of all the long 1 and 20 that stretched between the two towns. Mary wished now that she had gone with Francis Davy. She could not hear the wind in Alternon, and the rain would fall silently at the sheltered lane. Tomorrow she could have knelt in the church and prayed for the first time since leaving Hilford. If what he said was true, then there would be cause for rejoicing at all. There would be some sense in giving thanks. The day of the wreckers was over. He would be broken by the new law, he and his kind. They would be blotted out and razed from the countryside as the pirates had been 20-30 years ago, and there would be no memory of them any more, no record left to poison the minds of those who should come after. A new generation would be born who had never heard of their name. Ships would come to England without fear. There would be no harvest with the tide. Calls that had sounded once with the church of footsteps on the shingle and whispered voices of men would be silent again, and the scream that broke upon the silence would be the scream of a gull. Beneath the placid surface of the sea, on the ocean bed, lay skulls without a name, green coins that had once been gold, and the old bones of ships. They would be forgotten forevermore. The terror they had known had died with them. It was the dawn of a new age, when the men and women would travel without fear. And the land would belong to them. Here on this stretch of moor, farmers would till their plot and soil and stack with sods of turf to dry under the sun as they did today, but the shadow that had been upon them would have vanished. Perhaps the grass would grow and the heather bloom again where Jamaica Inn had stood. She sat in the corner of the carriage with the vision of the new world before her, and through the open window, traveling down upon the wind, she heard a shot ring out in the silence of the night, and a distant shout and a cry. The voices of men came out of the darkness, and the padding of feet upon the road. She leaned out of the window, the rain blowing in her face. She heard the driver of the carriage call out in fear as his horse shied and stumbled. The road rose steeply from the valley, winding away to the top of the hill, and there in the distance were the lean chimneys of Jamaica Inn, crowning the skyline like a gallows. Down the road came a company of men, led by one who leaped like a hare and tossed a lantern before him as he ran. Another shot rang out, and the driver of the carriage crumpled in his seat and fell. The horse stumbled again and headed like a blind thing for the ditch. For a moment the carriage swayed upon its wheels, rocked, and there was still. Somebody screamed a blasphemy to the sky, somebody laughed wildly, there was a whistle and a cry. A face was thrust in at the window of the carriage, a face crowned with matted hair that fell in a fringe above the scarlet bloodshot eyes. The lips parted, showing the white teeth, and then the lantern was lifted to the window so that the light should fall upon the interior of the carriage. One hand held the lantern, the other clasped the smoking barrel of a pistol. They were long, slim hands, with narrow, pointed fingers, things of beauty and grace, the rounded nails crusted with dirt. Joss Merlin smiled, the crazy, leery smile of a man possessed, maddened, and exalted by poison. and he leveled the pistol at Mary, leaning forward into the carriage so that the barrel touched her throat. Then he laughed, and he threw the pistol back over his shoulder, and wrenching open the door, he reached for her hands and pulled her out beside him on the road, holding the lantern above his head so that all could see her. There were 10 or 12 of them standing on the road, ragged and unkempt, half of them drunk as their leader, wild eyes staring out in shaggy bearded faces, and one or two had pistols in their hands, or were armed with broken bottles, knives, and stones. Harry the peddler stood by the horse's head, while face downwards in the ditch lay the driver of the carriage, his arms crumpled under him, his body limp and still. Joss Merlin held Mary to him and tilted her face to the light, and when they saw who she was, a howl of laughter broke from the company of men, and the peddler put his 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled. The landlord bent to her, all bowed with drunken gravity. He seized her loose hair in his hand and twisted it into a rope, sniffing at it like a dog. "So it's you, is it?" he said. "You've chosen to come back again like a little whining with your tail between your legs?" Mary said nothing. She looked from one to the other of the men in the crowd, and they stared back at her, jeering, hemming in upon her and laughing, pointing to her wet clothes and fingering her bodice and her skirt. "So you're dumb, are you?" cried her uncle, and he hit her across the face with the back of his hand. She called out and put an arm up to protect herself, but he knocked it away, and holding her wrist, he doubled it behind her back. She cried with the pain, and he laughed again. "You'll come to heel if I kill you first," he said. "Do you think I can stand against Do you think you can stand against me with your monkey face and your darned impudence? And what do you think you can do at midnight, riding on the King's highway in a hired carriage, half naked with your hair down your back? You're nothing but a common slut, after all." He jerked at her wrist, and she fell. "Leave me alone," she cried. "You have no right to touch me or speak to me. You're a murderer and a thief, and the law knows it too. The whole of Cornwall knows it. Your reign is over, Uncle Joss, and I've been to Launceston today to inform against you." A hubbub rose among the group of men. They pressed forward, shouting at her and questioning, but the landlord roared at them, waving them back. "Get back, you darned fools! Can't you see she's trying to save her skin by lies?" he thundered. "How can she inform against me when she knows nothing? She's never walked the 11 miles to Launceston. Look at her feet. She's been with a man somewhere down on the road, and they sent her back on wheels when he'd had enough of her. Get up, or do you want me to rub your nose in the dirt?" He pulled her to her feet and held her beside him. Then he pointed to the sky, where the low clouds fled before scurrying wind and wet star gleamed. "Look there!" he yelled. "There's a break in the sky, and the rain's going east. There'll be more wind yet before we're through, and a wild grey dawn on the coast in 6 hours' time. We'll waste no more of it here. Get your horse, Harry, and put him in the traces here. The carriage will carry half a dozen of us, and bring the pony and the farm cart from the stable. He's had no work for a week. Come on, you lazy drunken devils. Don't you want to feel gold and silver run through your hands? I've lain like a hog for 7 crazy days, and I feel like a child tonight, and I want the coast again. Who'll take the road with me through Camelford?" A shout rose from a dozen voices, and hands were thrust into the air. One fellow burst into a snatch of song, waving a bottle over his head, reeling on his feet as he stood, and he staggered and fell, crumpling into his face in the ditch. The peddler kicked him as he lay, and he did not stir, and snatching the bridle and the horse, he dragged the animal forward, urging him with blows and cries to the steep hill, while the wheels of the carriage passed over the body of the fallen man, who, kicking for an instant like a wounded hare, struggled from the mud with a scream of terror and pain, and then lay still. The men turned with the carriage and followed it, the sound of their running feet pattering along the highroad. And Joss Merlin stood for a moment looking down upon Mary with a foolish drunken smile. Then, on a sudden impulse, he caught her in his arms and pulled her towards the carriage, wrenching the door once more. He threw her onto the seat in the corner, and then leaning out the window he yelled to the peddler to whip the horse up the hill. His cry was echoed by the men who ran beside him, and some of them leaped onto the step and clung to the window, while others mounted the driver's empty seat and ranged at the horse with sticks and a shower of stones. The animal quivered, sweating with fear, and he topped the hill at a gallop, with half a dozen madmen clinging to the reins and screaming at his heels. Jamaica Inn was ablaze with light. The doors were open and the windows were unbarred. The house gaped out of the night like a live thing. The landlord placed his hand over Mary's mouth and forced her back against the side of the carriage. "You'd inform against me, would you?" he said. "You'd run to the law and have me swinging on a rope's end like a cat? All right, then. You shall have your chance. You shall stand on the shore, Mary, with the wind and the sea in your face, and you shall watch for the dawn and the coming of the tide. You know what that means, don't you? You know where I'm going to take you." She stared back at him in horror. The color drained from her face, and she tried to speak to him, but his hands forbade her. "You think you're not afraid of me, don't you?" he said. "You sneer at me with your pretty white face and your monkey eyes. Yes, I'm drunk as a king, and heaven and earth can smash for all I care. Tonight we shall ride in glory, every man jack of us. Maybe for the last time you shall come with us, Mary, to the coast." He turned away from her, shouting to his companions, and the horse, startled by his cry, started forward again in his stride, dragging the carriage behind him, and the lights of Jamaica Inn vanished into the darkness. I feel like I should stop here. Yeah, I'm going to stop here and continue a little bit later. Thank you for listening.